Introduction. Long before empires etched their legacies onto history's canvas, when civilization was but a flickering flame in humanity's darkness, a whisper moved through the ancient world, not commanding from marble palaces, but dwelling among nomadic shepherds and desert wanderers who carried nothing but their fierce faith and heaven's covenant. This is the saga of a people who challenged everything others accepted as truth, questioning the very foundations of power, divinity, and existence itself. Follow their journey from the bustling bazaars of your ware merchants haggled beneath ziggurats, from sea waters standing like walls at a prophet's command to the hanging gardens of Babylon, where exiles reimagined their relationship with the divine. Witness the extraordinary transformation of one family's promise into the bedrock of 3 world religions. Marvel as former bondsmen become nation builders, as faith conquers seemingly impossible obstacles, and as hope's resilient flame burns brightest precisely when darkness seems most absolute. Part 1. Out of Mesopotamia, the Patriarchs and the Covenant. In the sprawling city of Ur, where ziggurats pierced the sky like stone fingers reaching for heaven, a man named Abraham heard a divine whisper that would forever alter humanity's spiritual journey. The bustling bazaars fell silent in his mind as this call echoed through his soul. Around 2000 BCE, when Sumerian culture had already flourished for over a millennium, Abraham lived amid the height of ancient achievement. Akkadian empires had risen and crumbled to dust, leaving sophisticated urban centers that represented humanity's greatest accomplishments. Yet from this cradle of civilization, this nexus of human ingenuity, one family would embark on a journey carrying seeds of faith that would outlast every empire ever built. Ur stood magnificent in its age. Its massive ziggurat dominated the skyline like a mountain crafted by human hands, while at its harbors, ships swayed with treasures from the Indus Valley and Iranian plateau. Clay tablets etched with cuneiform script documented a society of astonishing complexity: marriage contracts, commercial agreements, astronomical calculations, and literary works whose narratives would echo through millennia of human storytelling. Within this urban sophistication, Abram's family thrived, woven into the commercial tapestry connecting Mesopotamia to distant lands. When they abandoned the security of city walls for the harsh uncertainties of nomadic existence, they weren't just changing locations, they were rejecting the very spiritual framework of their world. Mesopotamian religion pulsed with cosmic forces personified as temperamental deities demanding constant appeasement. Each city claimed its patron gods, while regional deities commanded the storms, blessed fertility, and determined success in war. The concept of a single being claiming universal authority shattered fundamental assumptions about how the spiritual realm operated was nothing short of revolutionary. God's covenant with Abraham established patterns that would define sacred relationship for thousands of years to come. Unlike the surrounding polytheistic traditions with their distant, capricious gods, this new framework centered on intimate, personal communication between divine and human realms. This deity demanded exclusive devotion while promising blessings that stretched far beyond personal prosperity. 3 sacred promises would become the foundation of Hebrew identity: land stretching from Egypt to the Euphrates, descendants as countless as stars scattered across night skies and sand upon endless shores, and a blessing that would ripple outward to touch all nations of the earth. Canaan greeted Abraham with a landscape of breathtaking diversity: central hills offered perfect grazing for his flocks. Terraced slopes nurtured olive groves heavy with fruit. Coastal plains spread fertile soil under the control of Philistine city-states, while the Jordan Valley housed settlements commanding lucrative trade routes between Egypt and Syria. This geographic complexity meant successful settlement demanded diplomatic finesse as much as strength, for conflicts could quickly spiral beyond any single family's ability to manage. Canaanite religious practices centered on fertility deities, whose worship included rituals that would later be condemned as abominations. Baal, the storm god, received offerings at high places dotting the hillsides. Asherah, the mother goddess, was honored through sacred prostitution and elaborate ritual feasting. During times of crisis, child sacrifice represented the ultimate devotion to deities whose favor might mean survival itself. These practices embodied worldviews fundamentally incompatible with the emerging Hebrew monotheism. Abraham's interactions with local rulers required delicate negotiation of grazing rights, water access, and mutual defense arrangements. His agreements with figures like Melchizedek of Salem operated according to unwritten rules governing ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, where reputation and honor determined a family's ability to survive and prosper in hostile territories. Sacred covenant ceremonies followed patterns documented in Hittite treaties. The ritual of cutting animals and passing between their divided pieces represented self-cursing, oaths calling down similar destruction if commitments were violated. The smoking firepot and blazing torch passing between the pieces symbolized divine participation, indicating that God himself had undertaken these solemn obligations. This unprecedented arrangement placed divine reputation at stake in promises made to mortal humans. Sarah's barrenness created a crisis that tested faith while showcasing the legal wisdom of Mesopotamian culture. Her decision to offer Hagar as a surrogate followed customs where childless wives arranged for children through servants. The tensions that arose: Hagar's contempt, Sarah's harsh treatment, Abraham's discomfort vividly illustrated the costs of attempting to secure divine promises through human expedients. Ishmael's birth complicated the narrative by raising profound questions about divine promises and human actions. This firstborn son possessed legitimate claims based on inheritance law, yet he was not the child through whom the covenant blessings would continue. This tension between justice and grace would echo throughout Hebrew history as each generation struggled to understand divine sovereignty interacting with human responsibility. The transformation of Abram into Abraham through divine renaming represented far more than simple identity change. Abram meant exalted father, appropriate for his achieved prosperity. Abraham meant father of multitudes, pointing toward unfulfilled promises requiring tremendous faith. This renaming occurred alongside circumcision, the physical sign marking males as belonging to the chosen people. Unlike other cultures, performing circumcision at puberty as a rite of passage, Hebrew practice required infant circumcision on the 8th day. This timing emphasized that covenant participation was divine grace rather than human achievement. Since infants could neither choose their status nor demonstrate worthiness, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah revealed moral dimensions of the covenant, while demonstrating divine justice. These Jordan Valley cities had become notorious for practices violating basic standards of hospitality and justice. Abraham's bold intercession showed that covenant relationship carried responsibilities for advocating on behalf of broader humanity, even when thoroughly corrupt. Isaac's binding on Mount Moriah probed the very depths of Abraham's commitment. This command to sacrifice the son, through whom promises would be fulfilled, created contradictions human logic could not resolve. This same mountain would later become Solomon's temple site, establishing powerful connections between patriarchal faith and institutional worship. The provision of a substitute sacrifice introduced vicarious atonement, principles later developed fully in Mosaic sacrificial systems. Sarah's death necessitated the first Hebrew land purchase in Canaan. Abraham negotiated with Hittite elders for burial sites, following elaborate diplomatic protocols, insisting on full payment rather than accepting gifts. This transaction established legitimate ownership while demonstrating respect for local customs. Finding Isaac's wife revealed careful attention to preserving cultural and religious identity. Abraham's insistence that Isaac not return to Mesopotamia, while requiring his wife come from their ancestral homeland, reflected the tension between maintaining family connections and commitment to the Promised Land. Elaborate divine guidance led to Rebekah, whose immediate and decisive response demonstrated the faith required for covenant participation. Esau and Jacob's birth introduced conflict that would persist for generations. The oracle given during Rebekah's pregnancy predicted the older would serve the younger, reversing normal inheritance patterns while establishing divine choice over birth order. This principle would repeatedly appear as God chose David over his older brothers and Solomon over Adonijah, working through unexpected agents to accomplish divine purposes. Esau's sale of his birthright for a mere bowl of stew revealed fundamental value differences between those prioritizing immediate gratification over long-term promises. His rejection wasn't merely a momentary lapse in judgment, but reflected a consistent pattern later confirmed through his Canaanite marriages and apparent indifference to the spiritual dimensions of his heritage. Jacob's deception in securing the birthright blessings reveals the complex interplay between human action and divine destiny. Though God had prophesied the younger would rule the elder, Jacob's calculated fraud forces us to question: when should we trust divine timing versus taking matters into our own hands? The bitter fruits of this deception, Esau's murderous rage and Jacob's exile, suggest that manipulating circumstances, even toward divinely promised ends, exacts a heavy price. At Bethel, Jacob's extraordinary dream revolutionized theological understanding. The latter, with angels ascending and descending, shattered the notion that God's presence was fixed to specific locations. This revelation demonstrated that divine activity could unfold wherever covenant people journeyed. Jacob's stone memorial and solemn vows transformed Bethel into a sacred landmark for generations to come. Jacob's 2 decades with Laban became a masterclass in preserving covenant identity within a hostile environment. Laban's household idols represented the polytheistic worldview Jacob's family had rejected. Their constant disputes over breeding rights, wages, and broken agreements highlighted the challenge of maintaining integrity. When surrounded by those operating under different moral codes, the marriages to Leah and Rachel, born of Laban's cunning deception, created family dynamics that would echo through tribal relationships for centuries. The fierce competition between the sisters for children revealed the Shemaner culture's influence, while establishing the tribal framework later formalized during the wilderness wanderings. Each son's birth carried prophetic significance, foreshadowing future tribal characteristics. The 12 patriarchs emerged from this crucible of family conflict, demonstrating how divine sovereignty works through flawed human relationships to accomplish eternal purposes. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi would eventually forfeit their leadership positions through moral failures, while Judah would emerge as the royal lineage. Joseph and Benjamin would become the family's preservers during famine, necessitating their migration to Egypt. Jacob's mysterious wrestling match at Peniel marked the pinnacle of his spiritual journey. This enigmatic, night-long struggle embodied Jacob's lifelong attempt to secure blessing through self-reliance and cunning. His permanent, physical reminder of divine encounter taught that true blessing comes through surrender rather than conquest. The new name Israel, meaning one who struggles with God, captured his transformed identity. When Jacob finally reunited with Esau, both brothers showed remarkable transformation. Esau's prosperity demonstrated that divine blessing extended beyond covenant bloodlines, while their peaceful reconciliation revealed maturity, replacing former hatred. Their separate journeys confirmed their distinct destinies. Despite renewed brotherhood, Jacob's land purchase at Shechem established connections with local populations that would have far-reaching consequences. The pilgrimage back to Bethel offered spiritual renewal, while establishing that moral crises required returning to places of proven divine encounter. The burial of foreign gods and purification rituals revealed that Jacob's household had gradually incorporated incompatible religious practices during their Mesopotamian sojourn. Rachel's death during Benjamin's birth brought a final devastating tragedy, profoundly shaping Jacob's emotional landscape. Her burial near Bethlehem established a memorial site venerated for generations. The ornate coat of many colors, symbolizing Jacob's favoritism, reflected ancient inheritance customs, while dramatically illustrating the destructive potential of parental preference. Judah's proposal to sell rather than murder Joseph revealed moral complexity while foreshadowing his emergence as a leader despite being the fourth-born son. Joseph's service in Potiphar's household illustrated the challenges of maintaining covenant moral standards when immersed in a culture with fundamentally different ethical expectations. Joseph's steadfast refusal of Potiphar's wife's advances, framed as responsibility to both human master and divine lord, demonstrated exemplary faithfulness. His unjust imprisonment created the precise circumstances needed to establish court connections essential for his eventual elevation. His gift of dream interpretation manifested divine revelation through natural insight rather than occult practices. His accurate interpretation of the butler's and baker's visions established his reputation for divine wisdom. The butler's forgetfulness, though frustrating, illustrated human gratitude's unreliability, while ensuring perfect timing for Joseph's eventual royal summons. Pharaoh's dreams, fat cows devoured by emaciated ones and healthy grain consumed by withered stalks brilliantly symbolized economic cycles. Joseph's interpretation identifying 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine, demonstrated Revelation's practical value while providing life-saving information. The administrative systems he designed for managing Egypt's vast resources revealed divinely inspired expertise honed through his years of servitude. By purchasing and storing 1/5 of all grain production, he created critical famine reserves while generating enormous revenue, fundamentally transforming ruler-subject relationships as virtually all land transferred to royal ownership, with citizens becoming tenant farmers. When Jacob's desperate sons arrived seeking grain, They initiated a complex series of interactions, culminating in their family's migration. Joseph's immediate recognition of his brothers, coupled with his decision to conceal his identity while testing their character, revealed his understanding that betrayal damaged relationships required careful restoration. His accusations of spying, demands for Benjamin, and staged cup theft served as tests to determine whether his brothers had learned to protect rather than sacrifice vulnerable family members. Judah's profound offer to remain as a slave in Benjamin's place demonstrated remarkable character transformation during the 20 years since Joseph's disappearance. His impassioned speech, acknowledging guilt while recognizing his father's desperate love for Benjamin, revealed moral growth that made reconciliation possible. Joseph's overwhelming emotional response, finally breaking his disguise, showed that forgiveness had been his ultimate goal throughout the testing process. His revelation of identity and interpretation of their shared history as divine providence working through humans' choices established theological principles that would influence Hebrew understanding throughout subsequent generations. His profound declaration that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, acknowledged both the moral reality of his brothers' actions and the divine purposes accomplished through them. Joseph's invitation for Jacob's entire family to resettle in Egypt reflected filial devotion and royal gratitude for the administrative wisdom that preserved Egypt during catastrophic famine. The allocation of Goshen demonstrated their honored status while providing physical isolation that enabled them to maintain cultural and religious distinctiveness throughout their Egyptian sojourn. Jacob's journey to Egypt required divine reassurance that this migration served covenant purposes rather than abandoning them. The vision at Beersheba, promising development into a great nation in Egypt, while guaranteeing eventual return to the Promised Land, established the theological framework for understanding this sojourn as necessary fulfillment rather than deviation. The reunion after 22 years of separation represented the emotional climax of the patriarchal narrative, while demonstrating how providence uses even family tragedy to accomplish purposes no human planning could achieve. Jacob's declaration that he could die peacefully, having seen Joseph alive, reflected the parental love that had shaped his emotional life since Rachel's death. His final 17 years provided opportunity for observing his grandson's development while establishing traditions preserved during the centuries of Hebrew residence in Egypt. Joseph's adoption of his sons as equals with Jacob's other sons reflected his special status and recognized that his Egyptian-born children needed formal incorporation into the community to ensure tribal inclusion. Jacob's deliberate crossing of hands to bless Ephraim over Manasseh continued the pattern of divine choice, operating independently of natural inheritance rights. His explanation that the younger would become greater anticipated Ephraim's future prominence in the northern kingdom. Jacob's final blessings upon his 12 sons combined prophetic insight with poetic artistry, anticipating tribal characteristics and destinies. Reuben's loss of preeminence through instability, Simeon and Levi's dispersion through violence, Judah's royal emergence, and Joseph's special blessings established expectations that would influence tribal relationships for centuries. Jacob's death at 147 marked the end of the patriarchal period, while establishing precedents for maintaining connection with the Promised Land despite residence in Egypt. His insistence on burial in Canaan demonstrated continuing faith in the promises while creating obligations for descendants. to maintain their distinctive identity rather than completely assimilating into Egyptian culture. Joseph's death at 115 created transition, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would define Hebrew identity during the following centuries. His final words expressing confidence in their eventual return to the Promised Land, while requiring the transportation of his bones during the future Exodus, maintained hope in the promise, while acknowledging its fulfillment lay in future generations. Joseph's body, preserved according to Egyptian embalming practices, reflected his successful integration into Egyptian society, while coffin burial rather than immediate transport to Canaan demonstrated faith in the eventual return to their inheritance. The preservation of his embalmed body created tangible reminders of the promise during years of prosperity, when assimilation into Egyptian society might have seemed more attractive than maintaining Hebrew distinctiveness. The multiplication of Jacob's descendants fulfilled Abraham's promise that his offspring would become as numerous as the stars of heaven and sand on the seashore. The tribal structure provided organizational framework, enabling the growing population to maintain its identity despite centuries in foreign lands, with superior cultural attractions and greater advancement opportunities. The promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remained the driving force of Hebrew identity, even as circumstances changed dramatically. Land promises, though temporarily suspended, continued shaping expectations, preventing complete assimilation. Descendant promises, visibly fulfilled through rapid population growth, encouraged faith in divine commitment. Blessing promises, demonstrated through their prosperity in Egypt, provided evidence of continuing divine favor while anticipating the future impact they would have as a nation. The patriarchal foundations, like ancient roots beneath a mighty tree, established theological truths, cultural practices, and ethnic identity that would sustain the Hebrew people through 4 centuries of Egyptian residence. These foundations weren't merely historical relics, but living traditions that preserved their unique character while preparing them for the metamorphosis from extended family into nation. Sacred covenants with the divine promises of a homeland awaiting their return. Tribal structures binding them in kinship, and the profound conviction of their chosen purpose. These became the 4 pillars supporting them through coming tribulations. The stage was now set for Hebrew history's dramatic next chapter. Prosperity would wither into brutal oppression. Jacob's descendants would raise anguished cries toward heaven, and divine intervention would thunder forth, revealing the awesome power of the God who had called Abraham from distant Ur and faithfully sustained his family through every twist and turn of their extraordinary journey. Through it all, the ancient promises remained unbroken. Sacred relationships endured, and divine purposes advanced inexorably forward, employing whatever means necessary to accomplish what no human strength could achieve, nor mortal wisdom could conceive. Part 2. Bondage and Deliverance. The Exodus and the Mosaic Law. The Golden Age died slowly, like a sunset that lingers before surrendering to darkness. For centuries after Joseph's triumphant presentation of his family to the royal court, his descendants had multiplied beyond all expectation, exactly as the Almighty had promised Abraham. Yet this very blessing became their curse. Where once the thriving settlements in Goshen pleased the crown, now they struck fear into royal hearts. A new dynasty ruled Egypt. Pharaohs who knew not Joseph in palace corridors where Joseph had once walked as second only to the king himself. New voices whispered warnings. Look how the children of Abraham have become more numerous and mightier than we. The irony was bitter. The very fertility that marked them as blessed by heaven had marked them for destruction by earthly powers. Each birth that should have brought joy instead brought terror to parents who saw their growing numbers reflected in the increasingly hostile eyes of their hosts. The transformation from honored guests to slaves happened gradually, then suddenly. Administrative decrees stripped away privileges Joseph's family had enjoyed for generations. Property confiscations followed, justified by new laws that criminalized foreign ownership. Massive construction projects demanded laborers, and who better to provide them than these foreigners whose loyalty seemed questionable? Papyrus Anastasi records the harsh reality. Asiatic peoples bent beneath Egyptian whips, their backs breaking under impossible quotas of bricks and mortar. But the more severely they were afflicted, the more they multiplied and grew. This biological explosion defied every natural law the oppressors understood. Starving populations died out. Exhausted workers produced fewer children. Hopeless slaves lost the will to reproduce. Yet here the opposite occurred. Each new burden seemed to trigger another population surge. Each fresh persecution fueled another generation of births. The sight of pregnant women and nursing mothers throughout Goshen maddened the authorities, who had expected their harsh policies to achieve the opposite result. Desperation drove the crown to unthinkable measures. If natural attrition would not reduce their numbers, artificial means would. The order went out to the midwives. Every male child born to these people must die at the moment of birth. Shipra and Puah, whose gentle hands had brought hundreds of children safely into the world, suddenly found themselves appointed as executioners. The very women whose calling was to preserve life were commanded to destroy it. Yet, when summoned before Pharaoh's throne to explain their failure to reduce the birth rate, these brave women had their answer ready. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptians, they explained with carefully crafted innocence. They are vigorous and give birth before we can even arrive. Their deception saved countless lives, while revealing divine protection that operated even through such means when innocent blood was at stake. Frustrated by professional resistance, Pharaoh escalated to public policy. Every citizen of Egypt was now commanded to seize Hebrew male infants and cast them into the Nile. The river that had once brought prosperity through Joseph's wise administration would now run red with the blood of innocents. Genocide had become not just policy, but public duty. In this darkest hour, one woman refused to surrender hope. Jochebed gazed at her 3-month-old son and saw not a condemned child, but a gift that heaven itself must protect. The basket she wove with trembling hands, waterproofed with tar and pitch, became an ark of faith floating among the reeds. Her daughter Miriam crouched nearby, watching with the intensity of a guardian angel. As royal feet approached the water's edge, the princess who discovered the crying infant could have simply walked away. Royal daughters had no obligation to rescue the children of slaves, especially when that rescue defied her father's explicit commands. But something in the child's cry pierced her heart, and in that moment of compassion, the very household that had decreed death became the instrument of preservation. With royal privilege protecting him and royal resources funding his education, the future liberator would grow up in the halls of power, mastering the very systems he would one day challenge. Miriam's quick thinking completed the circle of divine irony. "Shall I find you a nurse from among the Hebrew women?" she asked with calculated innocence. And so Jochebed, who had wept bitter tears as she placed her son among the reeds, found herself paid from the royal treasury to nurse and raise the child she had never truly lost. Under his mother's secret care, the boy absorbed two identities that would shape his destiny: the administrative brilliance of Egypt's elite and the sacred heritage of Abraham's promises. The child grew into a man caught between worlds. Palace education had given him access to Egypt's military academies, engineering schools, and diplomatic protocols. He mastered irrigation systems and architectural principles, military formations and siege techniques, tribute collection and population management. Yet clandestine visits to his people's settlements had shown him the terrible cost of these accomplishments: the broken bodies that built monuments, the shortened lives that enriched the crown, the cultural devastation that accompanied Egypt's economic prosperity. At 40, the internal tension finally erupted into decisive action. Witnessing an overseer beating a slave with potentially fatal brutality, he glanced this way and that to ensure no witnesses observed. Then he struck down the attacker and buried the body in the sand. Murder was a capital crime in Egypt, but this was something more. It was a declaration that divided loyalties could no longer coexist within a single heart. But discovery came through the very people he thought he was protecting. When he attempted to mediate a dispute between two Hebrews the next day, their response cut him to the quick. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed that Egyptian?" The rejection stung more deeply than any royal punishment could have. If his own people questioned his authority, how could he presume to lead them to independence? Flight to Midian brought both refuge and essential education. The wilderness became Moses' true university. For 40 years, the man who had mastered Egypt's royal curricula now learned wisdom from wind-swept dunes and star-filled nights. The shepherd's crook replaced the royal scepter as he developed skills no palace could teach. Under the desert's unforgiving tutelage, he discovered which desert plants betrayed hidden springs beneath the surface, how to read approaching storms in distant cloud formations, where to seek refuge when sandstorms howled across the wasteland, and how to navigate vast territories while keeping vulnerable flocks intact. His marriage to Zipporah, daughter of the priest Jethro, wove him into the intricate social fabric of Midianite tribal alliances, while immersing him in the rhythms of nomadic existence. Then came the flame that burned but did not consume the encounter that shattered his carefully constructed exile. What began as mere curiosity about an unusual natural phenomenon transformed into divine confrontation. The voice from within the burning bush identified itself as the same God who had summoned Abraham from distant Ur-di, who had wrestled with Jacob until daybreak, who had promised Joseph that his bones would one day return to Canaan. The moment of fulfillment had arrived, and this reluctant shepherd was to be its instrument, though every fiber of his being resisted the divine commission. "Who am I to approach Pharaoh?" Moses protested, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of self-imposed exile. "If they ask your name, what should I tell them? What if they refuse to believe me? My tongue stumbles over words. I cannot speak eloquently." Each objection revealed profound understanding of the insurmountable obstacles ahead. Royal courts did not grant audiences to fugitive murderers. Enslaved populations rarely rallied behind leaders who had already abandoned them once. divine purposes required human vessels, and this vessel felt cracked and utterly inadequate for such monumental responsibility. The divine response came not through mere reassurance, but through tangible demonstration of power. A shepherd's staff writhing as a serpent upon the sand, a hand withering with leprosy, then restored to health, water transforming to blood upon touching the ground. These signs would provide credentials no earthly authority could duplicate or dismiss. The appointment of Aaron as spokesman addressed Moses' concerns about eloquence, while establishing the priestly partnership that would define sacred service for generations to come. Together, the brothers would deliver heaven's ultimatum to earth's most powerful throne. The journey back to Egypt demanded immediate confrontation with complete obedience. When Zipporah performed emergency circumcision on their son during the journey, she was completing the covenant obligation that for decades in Midian had allowed to lapse. No uncircumcised male could represent heaven's covenant people before the divine throne. Personal holiness was not optional for those called to public ministry. Their first audience with their kinsman proved surprisingly encouraging. Decades of crushing servitude had prepared desperate hearts to embrace any glimmer of hope, however improbable. Aaron's demonstration of miraculous signs provided tangible evidence that their ancestral God possessed power beyond anything they had witnessed in generations. For the first time in 4 centuries, the descendants of Jacob dared to imagine that their bondage might have an end. The royal audience proved far more challenging. When Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh's throne and it transformed into a serpent, the court magicians promptly replicated the phenomenon through their mystical arts. When Aaron's serpent devoured theirs, it suggested superior power, but not necessarily a different source. The king's response revealed the arrogance that would characterize every interaction throughout the escalating conflict. Who is this Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not recognize your God, nor will I release his people. What followed was systematic divine warfare against entrenched earthly pride. Each plague struck with surgical precision at the foundations of royal power, while demonstrating the superiority of Jacob's God over Egypt's pantheon. The life-giving Nile transformed into a river of death when turned to blood, directly challenging Hapi's supposed dominion over Egypt's lifeblood. Frogs that invaded every household, from palace to hovel, mocked Heke's fertility blessings. Lice that tormented humans and beasts alike humiliated the gods of purification and ritual cleanliness. After each demonstration, the pattern repeated with maddening predictability. Initial royal capitulation, remove this plague, and I will release your people, would dissolve into stubborn defiance once immediate suffering subsided. Who is this Lord? I will not let them go. Pride and economic calculation consistently overwhelmed rational assessment of divine power. The livestock plague revealed divine ability to distinguish between populations occupying the same geographic region. Throughout Egypt, cattle and sheep collapsed in unprecedented numbers. Yet in Goshen, not a single animal belonging to the Hebrews perished. This selective judgment provided unmistakable evidence that supernatural forces were operating according to moral rather than natural principles. Boils followed, afflicting the court magicians themselves so severely they could no longer appear before Pharaoh to contest these divine signs. The priests, who legitimized royal authority through daily purification rituals, found themselves too ceremonially unclean to perform their sacred duties. The religious systems that buttressed political structures crumbled under divine assault. Hail, devastated the flax and barley harvest, while mysteriously sparing wheat and spelt that would ripen later, demonstrating precise control over natural forces. Those who heeded the divine warning sheltered their remaining livestock indoors and preserved them. Those who dismissed it watched helplessly as their animals perished in the fields. Even among the oppressors, individual response to divine revelation determined personal outcomes. The locust swarms that followed devoured every green thing the hail had spared, stripping Egypt's landscape to barren desolation. Courtiers, who had maintained loyal silence through previous catastrophes, finally broke ranks, pleading with their increasingly isolated monarch. How long will this man remain a snare to us? Release these people to worship their God. Can you not see that Egypt lies in ruins? 3 days of absolute darkness, so profound it could be physically felt, provided the perfect metaphor for spiritual blindness that refused to acknowledge divine sovereignty. Throughout Egypt, people groped in supernatural blackness, while Hebrew dwellings enjoyed normal daylight. The display of divine might, capable of extinguishing the very sun, Egypt's supreme deity and symbol of pharaonic power, left little doubt about whose authority would ultimately prevail. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Like a desperate gambler, he offered incremental concessions. Perhaps just the men could go worship. Then take your families, but leave your livestock behind, followed by go if you must, but don't venture far. Each negotiation revealed a ruler grasping at evaporating control, while refusing to fully surrender. The final confrontation required extraordinary faith, not just from the oppressors, but from the oppressed themselves. Imagine the courage needed to slaughter lambs throughout Goshen, daubing crimson life upon wooden doorposts, while hurriedly packing for departure. Inside these blood-marked sanctuaries, families huddled together as midnight approached, trusting that an invisible barrier would separate them from the devastation sweeping through Egypt. Outside, death moved like a silent tide, claiming firstborn lives from palatial nurseries to prison dungeons. That fateful night, Egypt's resistance crumbled completely. The king, who had defiantly questioned, "Who is the Lord?" now begged for mercy. "Rise up, leave my people immediately. Take everything, your flocks, your herds, all you possess, and be gone, and please, bless me also." For centuries of bondage dissolved, not through diplomatic negotiations or gradual liberation, but through panicked expulsion. Egyptians pressed valuable treasures, gold jewelry, silver vessels, fine clothing, into Hebrew hands, desperate to hasten their departure, before divine wrath claimed even more lives. An exodus of staggering proportions unfolded. 600,000 men, plus women, children, and elders, perhaps 2 million souls in total, accompanied by vast herds of livestock and joined by other oppressed peoples who recognized their chance for freedom. The logistical miracle defies modern comprehension, mobilizing, organizing, and moving an entire nation overnight. Yet supernatural guidance manifested physically, a towering pillar of cloud by day, transforming into luminous fire by night, providing navigation, while divine provision met every need. The circuitous route toward the Red Sea, rather than the more direct coastal path, revealed divine strategy. When Pharaoh's grief hardened once more into rage, and he dispatched his chariot corps, Egypt's supreme military technology, the liberated slaves found themselves in an impossible position. Deadly waters before them, Egypt's vengeful army behind 4 centuries of promised deliverance seemed to evaporate in this moment of apparent abandonment. Were there no graves in Egypt? They cried in bitter despair. Why bring us here to die in the wilderness? Their panic revealed how quickly liberation's euphoria could dissolve into terror when circumstances appeared hopeless. Moses's response established the spiritual principle that would define their national identity for millennia. Stand firm and witness the Lord's salvation. The Almighty will fight for you. You need only be still. The command to advance toward impassable waters demanded faith transcending human logic. As they stepped forward, massive walls of water rose on either side, revealing dry seabed beneath their feet. The same supernatural intervention that created their escape route became their pursuers' tomb. When Egypt's charioteers, overcome by battle, lust-charged into this liquid corridor, the suspended waters crashed down with devastating force, forever severing the chains of bondage that had defined Hebrew existence for generations. Miriam's triumphant song echoed along the eastern shore, her tambourine punctuating words that would resonate through the centuries. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has hurled into the sea. Yet beneath the celebration ran an undercurrent of solemn recognition. Their deliverance had required death for their enemies, a reality that tempered jubilation with gravity. The wilderness journey that followed stripped away every illusion about what freedom truly meant. At Marah, bitter waters revealed that liberation without transformation merely exchanges one hardship for another. At Eliam's oasis, they discovered that divine provision operates through faith rather than accumulated resources. The mysterious manna that appeared with morning dew taught daily dependence, while Sabbath regulations established sacred rhythms transcending immediate physical needs. Victory over Amalekite raiders demonstrated that divine protection operates through human courage and perseverance, with supernatural assistance arriving when human efforts reach their limits. Arrival at Mount Sinai marked their metamorphosis from liberated slaves into a constituted nation. The mountains, terrifying phenomena, thunderous reverberations, blinding lightning, earth-shaking tremors, and unearthly trumpet blasts that grew progressively louder, created an atmosphere of holy dread that prepared hearts to receive divine revelation. 3 days of meticulous preparation, washing garments, fasting, and abstaining from marital relations underscored that encountering divinity demanded reverent preparation rather than casual approach. The 10 Commandments that thundered from the mountain summit established foundations for covenant society that would revolutionize human legal development. Exclusive divine worship, protection of sacred names, honored sacred time, respected family structures, valued human life, binding marriage commitments, protected property rights, truthful testimony, and contentment with one's portion. These principles created a moral framework transcending cultural boundaries while maintaining distinctive identity. The detailed ordinances that followed translated these eternal principles into practical applications, spanning every aspect of communal life, from worship procedures to judicial decisions, property disputes to family responsibilities. This comprehensive legal system addressed everything from ceremonial purity to criminal justice, creating a unified approach to human existence. Economic provisions prevented exploitation while preserving productivity incentives. The sabbatical release of debts, gleaning rights for vulnerable populations, and special protections for widows and orphans created history's first comprehensive social safety net. without undermining personal responsibility. These regulations demonstrated that divine concern extended beyond ritual observance to encompass practical justice in everyday relationships. The golden calf catastrophe revealed how quickly covenant commitments could dissolve when divine presence seemed distant. While Moses received further instructions on the mountain, the people below grew restless, demanding visible deities that offered tangible security. Aaron's weak capitulation to popular pressure demonstrated that even spiritual leadership could compromise sacred standards when confronted with determined opposition. Moses' passionate intercession that prevented complete annihilation established the crucial role of mediatorial leadership in covenant relationships. His extraordinary offer, "Blot me from your book rather than destroy your people," revealed the selfless commitment required for effective spiritual guidance. The covenant renewal that followed demonstrated divine mercy operating alongside divine justice as fractured relationships were restored through genuine repentance and renewed commitment. The tabernacle construction became the heart of Israel's final wilderness year, a marvel of divine architecture where heaven and earth would meet. This portable sanctuary, with its intricate tapestries, precious metals, and sacred vessels, created sacred space in the midst of barren desert. Every meticulously crafted detail spoke of both divine holiness and accessibility: gold-covered acacia wood, violet and crimson yarns, bronze basins, and silver sockets, each element carrying profound symbolic significance. When the radiant pillar of cloud finally descended upon the completed structure, it validated their exhaustive labors and confirmed an astonishing truth. The Creator of all had chosen to dwell among these stubborn, flawed wanderers, despite their frequent rebellions. Meanwhile, the precise census organization transformed a wandering multitude into an ordered nation. Tribal banners snapped in the desert wind as families were counted, warriors registered, and leaders appointed. These meticulous arrangements weren't merely administrative. They were preparing a nation for conquest, establishing the military and governance frameworks that would distribute the promised inheritance. The 40-year delay following the spies' faithless report served as both punishment and preparation, as an entire generation who had known only slavery's chains returned to desert dust. Their children born under open skies and nourished on heavenly bread grew into a people who understood freedom's responsibilities and divine dependence's power. As they finally stood at Jordan's eastern bank, the promised land tantalizingly visible across the waters, Moses gathered them one last time, the aged lawgiver, his voice still commanding despite 120 years weathering his frame, delivered final addresses that resonated with historical reflection, legal wisdom, and prophetic warning. The Torah scrolls that emerged from these farewell speeches would become their permanent constitution, a sacred covenant text, preparing them for settled agricultural life under Joshua's leadership. Moses' death, with his strength undiminished and eyes undimmed, demonstrated divine sovereignty over human lifespan. His unmarked burial site on a lonely Moabite mountain prevented the inevitable shrine-building impulse, keeping Israel's focus on covenant relationship rather than personality veneration. Joshua's succession, carefully orchestrated through years of shared leadership responsibilities, ensured both continuity and fresh vision for changing circumstances. The people now assembling to cross Jordan bore almost no resemblance to the frightened slaves who had fled Egypt. This desert-forged generation stood tall with unshakable confidence, having witnessed divine provision with their own eyes daily. They possessed what their ancestors had lacked: a comprehensive legal code, unified worship practices, disciplined military organization, an absolute conviction that the fertile valleys and terraced hillsides before them were their divine inheritance. Everything converged for the imminent conquest that would test every lesson learned through 4 decades of divine education. The fabled Jordan River, swollen with spring floods, yet soon to part before them, had never seemed so narrow, nor the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so close to fulfillment. Part 3. Into the Promised Land. Conquest, judges, and tribal confederation. The Promised Land shimmered before them like a mirage made tangible, tantalizingly close, with wisps of smoke curling from distant Canaanite settlements, yet separated by the impassable barrier of the Jordan's raging waters. On the eastern bank, the children of Abraham stood poised in battle formation, their hearts thundering with anticipation. The swollen Jordan churned between them and destiny, its spring floods transforming the river into a roaring beast. Joshua, his shoulders now bearing the mantle of leadership once carried by Moses, understood with crystal clarity that the coming hours would determine whether 4 centuries of divine promises would finally materialize or dissolve at the very threshold of fulfillment. Unlike their ancestors, who had cowered at Kadesh Barnea 40 years earlier, the spies returning from Jericho brought reports that kindled faith rather than fear. Where the previous generation had seen only insurmountable giants and impenetrable fortifications, these scouts recognized divine preparation at work. Truly, they declared with unwavering confidence, the Almighty has delivered the entire land into our hands. The inhabitants tremble at our approach, their courage melting like morning dew. Even more remarkable was the testimony of Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, whose unexpected faith confirmed what Egypt's defeat and 40 years of wilderness provision had already demonstrated. Tales of their God's unstoppable power had raced through Canaan like wildfire, sowing terror that would make conquest possible. Yet a vast difference remained between knowing their enemies feared them and actually breaching the natural fortress of the Jordan. The river's churning waters seemed to mock their ambitions with every crashing wave. No vessel could navigate such furious currents. No shallow crossing existed when Mount Hermon's melting snowcaps sent torrents cascading toward the Dead Sea. Engineering a passage would require weeks of labor, giving watchful enemies ample time to prepare defenses. But heaven's solutions required only one thing: faith, willing to step directly into impossibility. Consecrate yourselves. Joshua commanded the priests bearing the sacred ark, his voice steady with conviction. Tomorrow the Lord will perform wonders among you that will echo through generations. The same ark that had journeyed through 40 years of wilderness wandering would now spearhead their advance into battle, its golden cherubim embodying heaven's throne, advancing against earthly kingdoms. When the priest's sandaled feet touched the river's edge, an act of pure faith, Jordan's waters recoiled, as though struck by an invisible hand. The rushing current halted, piling into a towering wall upstream, while the riverbed below dried instantly, creating a supernatural highway for the advancing nation. The same miraculous power that had split the Red Sea to deliver them from Egypt now parted the Jordan to usher them into their inheritance. 12 massive stones, hauled from the river's exposed depths, formed a monument at Gilgal, silent witness that would speak to generations who would never see these wonders with their own eyes. When your children ask in years to come, "What do these stones mean?" Joshua instructed, "Tell them how the waters of the Jordan parted before the Ark of the Covenant, proving that the living God journeys among us." Memory would prove as crucial as conquest in preserving their identity amidst the seductive cultural pressures awaiting them in Canaan. Jericho loomed before the Maz city, whose walls had withstood a millennium of warfare. Its double fortifications created a barrier that conventional Bronze Age siege tactics simply could not overcome. The foundations, alone massive hewn stone blocks, supported towering mud brick walls rising 30 feet skyward, with entire residential quarters built directly into the fortifications. Attacking such a stronghold using bronze weapons would normally require years of patient siege work, while defenders unleashed a deadly rain of arrows, stones, and burning oil from their elevated positions. But divine warfare operated by entirely different principles than human military strategy. The command to silently circle the city once daily for 6 days, while priests blew ram's horns, seemed utterly nonsensical by conventional military wisdom. No commander would willingly expose his entire force to enemy surveillance while accomplishing nothing of tactical value. Yet faith demanded obedience, even when heavenly instructions appeared counterintuitive or even foolish by earthly standards. On the 7th day, everything changed. 7 complete circuits around the walls, accompanied by continuous trumpet blasts, built toward a crescendo that culminated in a unified shout from hundreds of thousands of throats. The walls that had protected Jericho for a millennium suddenly collapsed as though struck by divine earthquake. The rubble forming convenient ramps that transformed impregnable barriers into invasion routes. Only one section remained standing: Rahab's house, built into the wall itself, marked by the scarlet cord hanging from her window like a beacon amid chaos. The devoted destruction that followed. Jericho's fall established the principles of holy war that would govern their conquest throughout Canaan. Everything within the city was either destroyed or consecrated to divine service. No soldier could enrich himself with plunder. Victory achieved through supernatural intervention could not be contaminated by personal gain. Achan's clandestine theft of gold and silver shattered this sacred covenant, bringing heaven's swift judgment upon the entire community. The divine displeasure remained, sobering reminder that individual actions could affect collective destiny. The unexpected defeat at Ai served as a painful lesson that divine favor could vanish in an instant when covenant obligations were breached. When Joshua fell prostrate before the ark, his anguished cry echoed across the camp. "Lord, why have you brought us across Jordan only to deliver us to destruction?" This raw moment of desperation illustrated the inseparable bond between divine presence and military victory. Once Achan's transgression was purged from their midst, Ai succumbed to a brilliantly executed ambush that showcased the perfect harmony between human strategy and divine guidance. The Gibeonite deception presented a challenge that tested Israel's discernment as much as their military prowess. Emissaries arrived from this powerful city-state dressed in tattered garments, carrying moldy bread and worn wineskins, claiming to have journeyed from a distant land seeking alliance. Joshua's critical failing to consult divine wisdom before accepting their treaty would create political complications that would reverberate through centuries of Israel's history. The shocking discovery that Gibeon actually lay within the boundaries designated for conquest created an ethical dilemma. How to honor sworn agreements made under false pretenses, while remaining faithful to divine commands regarding Canaanite removal. This diplomatic entanglement soon erupted into armed conflict when neighboring kingdoms formed the Southern Coalition, viewing Gibeon's capitulation as treacherous collaboration with the invaders. When 5 kings besieged Gibeon to punish their submission, Joshua found himself honor-bound to defend people he had never intended to spare. His forces completed an extraordinary forced march through rugged mountain terrain in a single night, arriving at Gibeon's walls just as they were about to crumble under assault. What followed transcended even the most remarkable military victories recorded in ancient chronicles. The sun itself stood motionless over Gibeon, and the moon remained fixed above the valley of Ajalon. This cosmic miracle suspended natural laws, extending daylight to enable complete victory, while demonstrating divine sovereignty over the very celestial bodies that Canaanites worshipped as deities. Massive hailstones rained from cloudless skies, striking down more enemies than Hebrew weapons could claim, undeniable evidence that victory belonged to the Lord rather than human might. The 5 kings who sought refuge in Makedah's cave found it becoming their tomb instead. The symbolic ritual that followed Joshua's commanders, placing their feet upon the royal necks before execution, borrowed from ancient Near Eastern victory traditions, visually proclaiming the subjugation of earthly authority to divine kingship, while emboldening troops who would face similar foes. Throughout the continuing campaign, the Northern Coalition, marshaled under Jabin of Hazor's command, presented an entirely different military challenge. These kingdoms boasted technological superiority, with iron-reinforced chariots 900 in total, representing the most advanced warfare technology of their era. Their alliance spanned territories from Mediterranean coastal plains to the Jordan Valley, with Hazor itself standing as one of Canaan's most imposing urban centers, its massive fortifications sprawling across an intimidating expanse. Joshua's tactical brilliance shone in the pre-dawn assault at the waters of Merom, striking while enemy forces were still assembling their formations. He transformed their technological advantages into crippling liabilities. Chariots became immobilized obstacles rather than swift weapons on the broken, muddy terrain. His subsequent decision to hamstring captured horses rather than incorporating this coveted military asset into his own forces demonstrated unwavering commitment to divine dependence rather than conventional military might. True victory, Joshua understood, stemmed from faith rather than superior armaments. Yet even the most spectacular divine interventions could not complete the conquest overnight. When biblical accounts state that Joshua took the whole land, they describe strategic dominance rather than total occupation. Significant Canaanite populations persisted in numerous regions, creating conditions for ongoing cultural and religious tensions that would define Israel's subsequent history. This incomplete conquest carried both blessing and curse, providing opportunities for cultural enrichment, while presenting constant temptations toward spiritual compromise. The tribal allotments distributed at Shiloh established the territorial framework that would shape Israelite identity for 8 centuries to follow. The elaborate ceremony of casting lots before the sacred tabernacle emphasized that land distribution reflected divine will rather than human preference, while meticulously documented boundary descriptions established permanent claims designed to withstand political upheavals and foreign conquests. Caleb's inheritance of Hebron stood as testament to divine faithfulness, rewarding the courage he had demonstrated 45 years earlier, when he alone with Joshua had advocated immediate conquest despite intimidating obstacles. The ingenious institution of refuge cities created sanctuaries where those who had accidentally caused another's death could find protection from blood vengeance while awaiting fair trial. This remarkable legal innovation balanced mercy with justice, demonstrating how divine law safeguarded the innocent even when circumstances appeared to condemn them. The provision that refugees must remain within these designated cities until the high priest's death created temporal boundaries around sanctuary while maintaining clear distinction between accidental and intentional homicide. Levitical cities, strategically distributed throughout every tribal territory, ensured consistent religious instruction and judicial administration across the entire nation. This arrangement provided economic support for priestly families through tithes and offerings, while preventing excessive religious centralization that might disconnect sacred worship from everyday life. The Levites' presence ensured that divine law would be uniformly interpreted and applied across all tribal boundaries, maintaining national cohesion despite geographical distribution. Joshua's final assembly at Shechem confronted the people with an ultimatum: choose exclusively between wholehearted devotion to Yahweh or accommodation with Canaanite religious practices. His challenge, choose this day whom you will serve, acknowledged the inevitable cultural pressures awaiting them while demanding explicit commitment to covenant faithfulness. The solemn covenant renewal ceremony that followed established a binding constitution for the tribal confederation, creating clear accountability for any future apostasy. The massive stone monument, erected beneath Shechem's sacred oak, served as silent witness to promises made in the shadow of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Moses had commanded the tribes to pronounce blessings for covenant obedience and curses for rebellion. This enduring memorial would remind future generations that their ancestors had consciously chosen exclusive allegiance to Yahweh. Fully aware of the cultural sacrifices such commitment would demand in a land saturated with alternative religious practices, Joshua's death at the venerable age of 110 marked the end of unified leadership and the beginning of a tribal confederation that would test every principle established during the conquest period. The generation that had personally witnessed miraculous victories and daily divine provision gradually yielded to children who knew these wonders only through inherited stories rather than first-hand experience. Cultural pressures that had been successfully resisted during wartime intensified during peacetime, as intermarriage, commercial exchange, and agricultural cooperation created unavoidable daily contact with remaining Canaanite populations. The pattern that would define the next 2 centuries emerged almost immediately. Incomplete conquest left significant Canaanite populations throughout tribal territories, creating persistent temptation toward religious and cultural accommodation. The agricultural techniques that yielded abundant harvests appeared inextricably linked to fertility rituals honoring Baal and Asherah, while commercial relationships often required participation in festivals and ceremonies dedicated to local deities. Gradual spiritual compromise followed as practical considerations increasingly overshadowed religious convictions. Divine judgment arrived through the very peoples Israel had failed to eliminate completely. Canaanite kings who had survived as tributaries discovered opportunities to reverse their subordinate status when their former conquerors abandoned the divine allegiance that had made victory possible. Devastating raids, humiliating tribute demands, and territorial encroachment created the oppression that would eventually drive the tribes back to Yahweh in desperate prayer for deliverance, setting the stage for the tumultuous period of the Judges. Like the relentless tide, Israel cycled through periods of faithfulness and rebellion with haunting predictability. Apostasy inevitably led to oppression as divine protection withdrew. Under the crushing weight of foreign dominance, the people would cry out in genuine repentance. Heaven would answer with deliverance, ushering in peace that gradually bred complacency, setting the stage for renewed apostasy. With each revolution of this spiritual wheel, the pattern cut deeper into the national consciousness, simultaneously revealing the boundless patience of their God and the persistent frailty of human devotion. When existential threats loomed over the tribes, the Spirit of the Lord would descend upon chosen individuals, igniting them with extraordinary abilities, precisely calibrated to the crisis at hand. These judges stood apart from hereditary monarchs. They were divinely appointed champions whose authority flowed directly from heaven rather than earthly succession. Their emergence followed no human logic or timeline, appearing instead according to divine wisdom that selected unexpected vessels for extraordinary purposes. Othniel's triumph over Cushan-Rishathaim of Mesopotamia established the blueprint for divine intervention throughout this tumultuous era. When Israel's collective cry of repentance reached heaven, supernatural empowerment enabled outnumbered and outmatched forces to overcome seemingly invincible enemies. These victories ushered in decades of prosperity and peace, 40 years of tranquility under Othniel's steady hand. Yet, upon his death, the testing of Israel's faithfulness would begin anew. The tale of Ehud reveals divine ingenuity working through unlikely means to accomplish profound ends. This left-handed Benjaminite approached the corpulent Moabite king Eglon with a concealed dagger, exploiting the assumptions of royal guards who never suspected a tribute-bearer would pose an assassination threat. The vivid account of Eglon's demise, with details both gruesome and darkly comic, underscored how heaven could transform apparent disadvantages into decisive strengths. The subsequent rallying of tribal forces illuminated both the Confederation's latent power and its structural weaknesses. When charismatic leadership unified the scattered tribes around common purpose, they proved formidable against any oppressor. Yet, sustaining such unity during peacetime remained elusive, as local concerns inevitably overshadowed national interests without the binding pressure of immediate threat. Deborah's emergence as prophetess and judge shattered gender conventions while exemplifying divine willingness to work through any vessel responsive to heavenly calling. Her judgment seat beneath the palm between Ramah and Bethel became a center of wisdom where tribal disputes found resolution through insight, transcending local custom. More remarkably, her authority extended into military leadership when circumstances demanded action that male counterparts hesitated to undertake without her direct involvement. Barak's reluctance to confront Sisera without Deborah at his side revealed how thoroughly Canaanite military superiority had intimidated tribal forces. The 900 iron chariots under Sisera's command represented technological dominance that could control vast territories through unmatched mobility and devastating strike capability. Yet Deborah's faith pierced through conventional military assessments as she confidently proclaimed divine intent to deliver the entire Canaanite host into their hands, a promise that seemed to defy every strategic calculation. The climactic confrontation at Mount Tabor showcased divine mastery over natural forces as unexpected torrential rains transformed the Jezreel Valley into treacherous marshland. Sisera's dreaded chariot, symbols of Canaanite military superiority, became mired obstacles rather than swift weapons of war. The Kision River, swollen to raging torrents by the downpour, swept away retreating soldiers as heaven completed what human courage had initiated. Jael's execution of the fleeing Sisera introduced moral ambiguities that would characterize the entire Judges period. Her violation of sacred hospitality laws, killing a guest who sought refuge in her tent, illustrated how conventional ethics sometimes clashed with divine purposes. Though her methods raised profound questions about means and ends, her decisive action eliminated a commander who could have rallied scattered forces for renewed assault, earning her veneration in Deborah's triumphant song. Gideon's calling exemplified divine preference for humble instruments that would attribute victory to heaven rather than human prowess. Found threshing wheat in a wine press, hiding from Midianite raiders who had terrorized the region for 7 devastating years, Gideon hardly appeared a warrior. The angel's greeting, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor," seemed almost satirical given his circumstances, yet prophetically anticipated the transformation divine purpose would work in this unlikely hero. The famous fleece tests revealed honest doubt wrestling with divine calling as Gideon sought confirmation that heaven truly intended to use someone as insignificant as himself for national deliverance. Divine patience with these repeated requests demonstrated compassionate understanding of human limitations, while providing the assurance needed to sustain faith through the seemingly impossible challenges that lay ahead. The systematic reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to a mere 300 eliminated any possibility that human might would receive credit for victory over the vast Midianite horde. This deliberate handicapping emphasized supernatural intervention while testing faith to its breaking point. The selection method that retained only those who remained vigilant while drinking revealed divine attention to character qualities that conventional recruitment processes would overlook entirely. The midnight assault with torches, trumpets, and shattering clay jars achieved psychological rather than physical victory. Midianite forces, jolted from sleep by sudden cacophony and bewildering lights, turned weapons against their own ranks as confusion spiraled into panic. Divine terror amplified natural disorientation, transforming Gideon's tiny band into catalysts of chaos rather than conventional combatants. In a masterful reversal, the enemy's overwhelming numbers became their greatest vulnerability when turned against themselves in the darkness. The kingship offered to Gideon following his victory tested whether military success would corrupt divine purpose through human ambition. His principled rejection, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you," established the theological foundation that divine sovereignty precluded human dynasty. Yet his creation of an ephod that later became an object of idolatrous worship demonstrated how quickly well-intentioned religious innovations could devolve into spiritual snares. Abimelech's bloody ascension through the slaughter of his 70 brothers revealed the political chaos that followed effective leadership when no institutional structures existed for peaceful succession. His dependence on foreign mercenaries and Shechemite support exposed how rapidly tribal unity could dissolve when self-interest eclipsed shared identity. The civil conflict that consumed his reign illustrated the Confederation's vulnerability to self-destruction when competing ambitions superseded common purpose. Samson embodied supernatural strength operating through profoundly flawed human character, demonstrating simultaneously divine sovereignty and human accountability. His Nazirite consecration from birth set him apart for sacred purpose. Yet his emotional vulnerabilities and moral failures proved that spiritual gifts did not automatically produce spiritual maturity. The personal vendettas driving his conflict with Philistine oppressors escalated into guerrilla warfare that struck terror throughout enemy settlements. The riddle posed at his wedding feast encapsulated the personal animosity that would drive the larger political struggle between emerging iron technology and traditional Bronze Age culture. Samson's retribution for his wife's betrayal demonstrated how individual action could challenge foreign domination even when tribal confederation failed to mount unified resistance. His growing recklessness with divine endowment foreshadowed the tragic end awaiting those who treat sacred calling as personal possession rather than divine trust. Delilah succeeded where Philistine armies had failed, exploiting emotional vulnerabilities that physical might could never protect against. Samson's gradual revelation of his strength's source highlighted the spiritual blindness accompanying moral compromise. He failed to recognize divine departure until supernatural power had already withdrawn. His final victory at the Philistine temple claimed his life while eliminating more enemy leadership than his entire previous career had accomplished. A costly triumph that epitomized both his greatness and tragic limitations. 2 centuries of this cyclical pattern revealed both the potential and constraints of decentralized governance under divine authority. When spiritual commitment remained robust and external threats manageable, the system provided effective leadership while preserving distinct tribal identities. When faith faltered, however, the loose confederation proved inadequate for national survival against organized enemies. The ascendancy of Philistine power along the coastal plain created external pressure that would ultimately compel the tribal confederation to abandon decentralized leadership for monarchical institutions, capable of mounting unified resistance. Iron weaponry and sophisticated urban fortifications gave Philistine city-states decisive advantages over tribal forces equipped with bronze implements and limited siege capabilities. Their methodical expansion inland threatened to fracture tribal territories, while establishing permanent strongholds throughout the hill country. Economic transformation accompanied political fragmentation as tribes adapted to agricultural life that demanded different competencies than nomadic herding had required. Terraced hillsides nurtured flourishing olive groves and vineyards, while valley communities produced grain surpluses, enabling population growth and craft specialization. Iron technology gradually supplanted bronze implements as Philistine metallurgical expertise spread through commercial exchange despite military hostilities. Cultural integration proved as challenging as technological adaptation. Canaanite influence on language, jurisprudence, and religious practices intensified through intermarriage and commercial relationships. The names appearing among tribal leaders reflected linguistic borrowing, while legal procedures incorporated local customs that modified traditional practices. Religious observances absorbed elements from fertility cults while maintaining nominal allegiance to Yahweh. The Confederation's greatest vulnerability remained internal division that prevented coordinated response to external threats. Tribal rivalries, boundary disputes, and competing loyalties created weaknesses that adversaries exploited through diplomatic manipulation as effectively as military aggression. The The very diversity that had once represented strength became liability. When unity required subordination of local interests to national imperatives, religious deterioration paralleled political disintegration as local shrines competed with the central sanctuary, while private devotional practices replaced communal worship. The proliferation of household deities, neighborhood altars, and regional festivals fostered religious pluralism that undermined exclusive loyalty to Yahweh, while accommodating diverse spiritual inclinations that official religion failed to address adequately. Samuel's emergence as prophet and judge represented divine response to institutional breakdown through charismatic leadership that transcended tribal boundaries while maintaining religious authority. His annual circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah established a judicial framework providing consistent legal interpretation, while his prophetic ministry preserved divine communication when formal religious institutions had lost moral credibility. The Philistine crisis reached its apex as Samuel's career began with the catastrophic defeat at Aphek, where the Ark of the Covenant itself fell into enemy hands and Eli's priestly line faced near annihilation. The psychological devastation of losing their most sacred symbol while suffering military calamity created national trauma that conventional remedies could not address. Even the Ark's miraculous return, after inflicting plagues throughout Philistine territories, failed to restore confidence in traditional leadership structures. Popular pressure for institutional reform intensified as Philistine incursions penetrated deeper into tribal lands, while confederation mechanisms proved incapable of coordinating effective resistance. The demand erupted with unvarnished clarity. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations. This petition revealed both a pragmatic assessment of political necessities and a dangerous readiness to sacrifice distinctive identity in pursuit of conventional solutions. 2. Exceptional challenges. Samuel's prophetic warning about monarchy's cost, conscription, taxation, forced labor, and loss of tribal autonomy accurately foretold the burdens that would follow. Yet the people's response came without hesitation. We will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. The stage was set for transformation that would forge a unified monarchy capable of challenging surrounding powers while maintaining covenant relationship with Yahweh. This transition would test whether institutional authority could preserve the spiritual heritage that charismatic leadership had sustained, and whether national unity could coexist with divine allegiance that transcended earthly political arrangements. 2 centuries of tribal confederation had demonstrated that freedom demanded more than liberation from oppression. It required institutions capable of safeguarding independence against organized adversaries, while preserving the distinctive identity that gave such independence meaning. The descendants of Abraham stood at another crossroads, choosing between the familiar chaos of recurring failure and the uncertain promise of unprecedented transformation. As this chapter of their story closed, the aged prophet Samuel stood before the assembled elders at Ramah, carrying the weight of divine revelation and the burden of a nation yearning for change. Part 4. The United Monarchy. Saul, David, and Solomon. Samuel's weathered hands trembled not from age, but from righteous anger, his fingers curling into fists as he confronted the elders of Israel. For decades he had judged Israel with unwavering integrity, traversing the dusty roads between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, settling disputes beneath the shade of ancient terebinths, preserving justice with wisdom that came from above. Now these same men who had once hung on his every pronouncement stood before him, rejecting everything he embodied. "Give us a king to judge us like all the nations," they demanded, their voices carrying the desperate edge of a people who had lost faith in their own sacred distinctiveness. The irony cut deeper than any Philistine blade. These were the descendants of slaves who had walked through parted waters precisely because they were not like other nations. The God of Abraham had shattered Egypt's might, sustained them with bread from heaven, and toppled the walls of Canaan's fortresses specifically so they could demonstrate an alternative society, one governed by divine law rather than mortal ambition. Now they stood before Samuel, eager to surrender the very freedom that had been purchased with countless tears and sacrifices. Samuel's warning rang out with prophetic clarity that would echo through generations. "This will be the manner of the king who will reign over you," he declared, his voice steady despite the trembling in his soul. "He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. Some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over thousands and captains over 50s, will set others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and others to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots." The catalogue of royal prerogatives continued relentlessly. Taxation that would strip away their produce, conscription that would claim their children, confiscation that would seize their lands, forced labor that would bend their backs. Everything that Egyptian bondage had taught them to despise would be replicated under their own king, wearing a crown inscribed with their own name. The freedom their ancestors had died to secure would be voluntarily surrendered for the mirage of security. When Samuel finished his warning, the people's response exposed how completely fear had overcome faith. "No, we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Heaven's response came with the resigned acceptance of a parent watching a headstrong child ignore wisdom, hearken to their voice, and make them a king. If the people insisted on learning through bitter experience what they refused to accept through prophetic instruction, then experience would become their harsh teacher. The monarchy they demanded would be granted, complete with all the consequences Samuel had foretold. Saul's selection unfolded like divine irony, a towering young man from Benjamin, searching for nothing more consequential than his father's lost donkeys, who stumbled upon the prophet engaged in the mundane task of village sacrifice, standing head and shoulders above his countrymen. Saul possessed the commanding physical presence that impressed people, who equated impressive stature with leadership strength. He appeared to be exactly what the nation thought it needed, but his initial reluctance, hiding among the baggage when Samuel called him forward, suggested a humility that might withstand the corrupting influence of absolute power. Confirmation came through sacred lots cast before the assembled nation, the ancient ritual that had guided Israel's momentous decisions since Joshua divided the promised land. When Saul's name emerged from the selection process, it carried the divine legitimacy that popular acclaim alone could never provide. "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen?" Samuel announced to the gathered thousands. "There is none like him among all the people." The thunderous shout that arose, "God save the King," marked the final breath of one era and the first cry of another. Saul's reign began not with pageantry, but with crisis that tested whether this new monarchy could accomplish what tribal confederation had failed to achieve. The Ammonites' brutal siege of Jabesh-Gilead provided the perfect crucible for the untested king to prove his worth. The Ammonites' ultimatum cut to the heart of Israel's vulnerability: surrender, and have your right eyes gouged out as a permanent mark of shame to all Israel. This represented exactly the kind of organized oppression that had driven the people to demand royal authority in the first place. The Spirit of the Almighty that descended upon Saul transformed a reluctant farmer into a commander capable of inspiring unified action across ancient tribal boundaries. His dramatic dismemberment of oxen and distribution of the bloody pieces throughout Israel with the message, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel, so it shall be done to his oxen," demonstrated the coercive authority to compel cooperation that the judges had never possessed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 330,000 warriors assembled at Bezek, the largest fighting force Israel had ever fielded. The dawn assault on Ammonite positions achieved complete surprise through brilliantly coordinated tactics that exploited unified command, where loose confederation had previously struggled to coordinate even simple operations. Monarchical authority enabled complex battlefield maneuvers that divided enemy troops into isolated groups ripe for destruction. Not two of them were left together, the chronicler recorded with military precision, describing devastation so complete that Ammonite power was eliminated as a regional threat for a generation. Celebrations at Gilgal marked the formal establishment of the monarchy through sacred ceremonies that acknowledged both popular will and prophetic authority. Samuel's farewell address, delivered beneath the same stones that had witnessed Israel's first entry into the Promised Land, reviewed the divine history that had brought them to this pivotal moment through challenges that tested covenant faithfulness despite institutional change. "If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God." The supernatural thunderstorm that followed Samuel's prayer provided divine punctuation to his warning, demonstrating that heavenly authority transcended earthly institutions. Monarchy might satisfy popular demand for conventional leadership, but it could not exempt the nation from spiritual responsibilities that had governed their relationship with God since Sinai's lightning-scorched peak. The crown carried sacred sanction, but it also carried accountability that no mortal could escape. Saul's early military campaigns fulfilled popular expectations through victories that exposed both the magnificent possibilities and troubling limitations of monarchical power. The decisive success against Philistine garrisons that began with Jonathan's bold assault at Michmash proved royal ability to inspire coordinated resistance to foreign occupation. When Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed 20 Philistines in their daring initial attack, the psychological impact spread panic throughout enemy ranks like wildfire. A supernatural intervention through earthquake completed what courage had begun, toppling fortifications and opening escape routes where none had existed before. The first major clash between royal decree and sacred principles emerged during pursuit of the fleeing Philistines. Saul, in his zeal, issued a rash oath, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening." This command, ostensibly meant to maintain military momentum, nearly claimed an innocent life when Jonathan, unaware of his father's edict, tipped his staff into a honeycomb and tasted its sweetness for strength. When the transgression was discovered through sacred lots, Saul prepared to execute his own son. Only the passionate intervention of the troops, who recognized that Jonathan's earlier courage had made victory possible, prevented this tragedy. The incident revealed a dangerous pattern in Saul's leadership, rigid adherence to his own decrees at the expense of wisdom and mercy. The campaign against the Amalekites laid bare the fatal contradiction at the heart of Saul's kingship. Samuel's instructions left no room for interpretation. Utterly destroy all that belongs to Amalekiman and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. This was divine judgment in its most absolute form, demanding complete obedience, regardless of what human reason might consider practical or beneficial. Saul's selective compliance revealed the calculating pragmatism that would prove his undoing. With sword and spear, his forces cut down the common Amalekites, but preserved King Agag alive. They slaughtered the feeble and sickly animals, but carefully spared the prime livestock, the fat lambs, choice bulls, and anything else of value. When confronted by Samuel, Saul's defense rang hollow with self-deception. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. He failed to recognize that partial obedience was, in truth, complete rebellion. Samuel's rebuke fell like thunder on the battlefield. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience surpasses sacrifice, and heeding his word exceeds the fat of rams. For rebellion equals the sin of divination, and stubbornness mirrors idolatry and false gods. Because you have rejected the Lord's word, he has rejected you as king. The prophet's words cut through royal justification to expose the heart of true kingship, not autonomous rule, but faithful stewardship under divine authority. The execution of Agag that followed demonstrated prophetic authority, transcending royal power. Samuel himself took up the sword when the king had faltered. As your sword has made women childless, the aged prophet declared, so will your mother be childless among women. With those words, he struck down the Amalekite king, completing the judgment Saul had been unwilling to carry out. The severed body of Agag foreshadowed the kingdom that would likewise be torn from Saul's grasp. The spiritual aftermath manifested immediately. The divine presence that had empowered Saul's early victories departed, leaving a vacuum filled by a tormenting spirit. Like a lamp whose oil has run dry, the charismatic authority that once radiated from him flickered and died, leaving only the institutional shell of kingship. Though still addressed as Your Majesty and surrounded by the trappings of power, his capacity to inspire loyalty or achieve decisive action withered as mental torment gradually consumed his reason. Into this fractured court came David not as warrior or rival, but as musician, his skilled fingers drawing healing melodies from harp strings to soothe the king's troubled mind. Yet, even in this seemingly innocent arrangement, destiny was already weaving the threads of future conflict. The calming notes that brought temporary peace to Saul's troubled soul were played by the very hands that would one day grasp his crown. The divine favor that had departed from Saul was already flowing toward his replacement, creating inevitable tension between fading and rising authority. When Philistine aggression presented a new crisis, the stage was set for a confrontation that would capture humanity's imagination for millennia to come. In the valley of Elah, Goliath's daily challenge echoed across the ravine. Choose your champion to face me. If he prevails, we will be your servants. But when I strike him down, you will serve us. His booming voice embodied the ancient calculus of warfare, where superior size, equipment, and training determined outcomes. and single combat between champions decided the fate of nations. For 40 days, the giants' challenge hung unanswered in the air as both armies faced each other across the valley. Israel's warriors, despite their numbers, stood paralyzed by fear when confronted with an enemy who possessed every conventional advantage. Even Saul's desperate offer of extraordinary rewards, his daughter's hand in marriage, lifelong tax exemption, and elevation to nobility failed to produce a single volunteer. Seasoned soldiers understood the futility of confronting a warrior whose bronze armor alone outweighed most men. David arrived bearing only bread and cheese for his brothers, yet carrying something infinitely more valuable and checkable: faith. Where battle-hardened veterans saw certain death, the shepherd boy perceived divine opportunity. His question cut through military calculation to spiritual reality. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The words revealed a perspective that would define David's entire life, a vision that saw beyond physical circumstances to spiritual truth. His confrontation with Saul before the battle tested whether royal skepticism could extinguish divine calling. David's testimony about killing lions and bears while protecting his father's sheep was more than a young man's boast. It was a declaration of supernatural protection that operated outside conventional power structures. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine, he proclaimed with quiet certainty that brooked no argument. Saul's offer of royal armor, his own bronze helmet, coat of mail, and sword represented the desperate hope that equipment might compensate for David's youth and inexperience. The shepherd's rejection of these conventional weapons, after trying them on, was not impulsive stubbornness, but profound spiritual insight. Victory would come not through human means, but divine intervention. The 5 smooth stones he selected from the brook and the well-worn sling he carried represented perfect faith that required no mortal enhancement. This battle would determine not just military superiority, but whose God possessed real power. The confrontation itself unfolded with breathtaking swiftness. As Goliath's curses filled the valley, David's response revealed the true nature of the conflict. You come with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come in the name of the Lord Almighty, whom you have defied. The stone released from his sling flew with supernatural precision, striking the one unprotected spot on the giant's forehead. As Goliath crashed to earth like a fallen oak, David seized the Philistine's own massive sword and severed the head that had uttered blasphemies against heaven. The champion who had terrorized Israel's professional army lay vanquished by a shepherd boy wielding a weapon no military strategist would have deemed significant. In the aftermath of Goliath's fall, the psychological foundations of ancient warfare were laid bare. Where moments before Philistine warriors had stood tall with unshakable confidence, now panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. This dramatic reversal revealed a truth about battle in the ancient world, that morale and divine favor often outweighed numerical superiority or technological advantage. The Israelite forces, emboldened by witnessing God's power manifest through a shepherd boy, pursued their fleeing enemies relentlessly to the very gates of Ekron and Gath. What had begun as a defensive stand transformed into a sweeping offensive that reshaped the balance of power throughout the region. The triumphal songs that greeted the returning army planted seeds of discord that would eventually threaten Saul's throne. Women danced in the streets, their tambourines keeping rhythm as they sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. These words, meant as innocent celebration, fell like poison on the king's ears. Where others heard joyful praise, Saul detected sedition. The metrics of the song became an accounting of his inadequacy, exposing a popularity that could easily transform into political challenge. From that moment, bitter irony took root in Saul's reign. The very success necessary to legitimize his rule now threatened to undermine it. The relationship between king and hero deteriorated with frightening speed, revealing the tragic interplay between spiritual emptiness and political paranoia. What began as therapy sessions, skilled fingers drawing healing melodies from harpstrings to soothe the troubled monarch, once erupted into violence as Saul hurled his spear at the musician, transforming moments of potential healing into assassination attempts. Meanwhile, Jonathan's deep friendship with David created additional fractures in the royal household. The crown prince found himself torn between filial duty and spiritual discernment, recognizing that divine favor had indeed shifted from his father to his friend. Each of David's victories only deepened the king's torment, for they served as painful reminders that God's blessing had abandoned Saul's house. Every achievement that should have strengthened the monarchy instead highlighted the stark contrast between what Israel could accomplish with heaven's favor and what it endured under divine rejection. When Saul offered his daughter Michal in marriage, presenting it as royal reward, while secretly plotting a death trap, the scheme backfired spectacularly. David's success in slaying 200 Philistines as bride price, double the required number, demonstrated supernatural protection that no royal machination could overcome. During his years as an outlaw, David built the foundation for his eventual kingship. The 400 men who initially rallied to him in the wilderness, described as debtors, malcontents, and desperate men, became the core of a formidable fighting force, loyal to personal leadership rather than institutional authority. Their carefully targeted raids against Israel's enemies, coupled with their protection of vulnerable settlements, demonstrated effective governance where royal administration had failed. These actions won David popular support that would prove crucial in the years ahead. The cave at En-Gedi became the stage for a defining moment that revealed David's extraordinary character. With Saul unwittingly delivered into his hands, vulnerable and alone in the very cave where David and his men hid, the future king had a perfect opportunity for assassination. Yet he chose restraint, cutting only a corner of Saul's robe as evidence of his mercy. "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord," David declared. This remarkable self-control stemmed not from political calculation, but from spiritual conviction that sacred appointment created responsibilities transcending personal grievances. Saul's temporary reconciliation after the En-Gedi incident revealed his recognition of inevitable succession, yet simultaneously exposed his inability to overcome the jealousy consuming him. "I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand," he acknowledged with tears, only to resume pursuit once the emotional moment passed. The cycle of pursuit and reprieve that characterized their relationship painted a tragic portrait, a man consciously fighting against the very divine will he claimed to serve. As Philistine forces regrouped and launched new offensives, culminating in the critical confrontation at Mount Gilboa, Saul found himself increasingly desperate for guidance that would not come. Samuel's death had silenced the prophetic voice that might have offered direction. The massacre at Nob had destroyed the priestly mediation that might have secured divine favor. Thus, the king, who had demanded monarchy to provide security, now stood utterly isolated from every source of wisdom, precisely when he needed it most. With crisis looming and conventional counsel failing, Saul's consultation with the medium at Endor represented the ultimate apostasia. Soul-driven to seek through forbidden occult practices the divine communication his disobedience had forfeited. The ghostly appearance of Samuel brought not the comfort Saul sought, but devastating condemnation. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." The prophet who had once anointed Saul as king now pronounced his doom with supernatural finality that permitted no appeal. In that moment, the circle closed. The man who began his reign with prophetic blessing would end it under prophetic judgment. The final battle unfolded with grim inevitability. Philistine warriors, armed with superior iron weapons and functioning as a disciplined military unit, systematically overwhelmed Israelite resistance, handicapped by Bronze Age equipment and collapsing morale. Jonathan's death on the battlefield, the valiant prince falling alongside his brothers, eliminated the one potential bridge between old and new administrations. Saul's suicide, committed to prevent capture and desecration, ensured that divine judgment would be executed without mitigation. The Philistine desecration of royal bodies revealed the fate awaiting nations whose leaders abandoned sacred covenant for worldly solutions. The severed heads displayed in Philistine temples served as gruesome trophies, proclaiming the supposed impotence of Israel's God, while the bodies hung on the walls of Beth-shan stood as warnings to any who might resist Philistine expansion. Only the courageous night raid by the men of Jabesh-Gilead, remembering how Saul had once saved their city in his first military victory, prevented complete humiliation by recovering the royal remains for honorable burial beneath a tamarisk tree. David's response to news of Saul's death demonstrated the magnanimity that would characterize his reign. Rather than celebrating the fall of his persecutor, he tore his clothes in genuine grief. His haunting lament for Saul and Jonathan, "How the mighty have fallen," honored the previous administration while carefully avoiding any hint of triumphalism. His execution of the Amalekite, who claimed credit for killing Saul seeking reward, established a clear precedent. David would not tolerate those who showed disrespect for sacred appointment, even when that appointment had failed. The division of the kingdom following Saul's death tested whether David's character could withstand the temptations of power amid the very tribal tensions that monarchy had been instituted to resolve. His coronation as king of Judah at Hebron provided constitutional foundation for eventual reunification, while Ishbosheth's installation as puppet king over the northern tribes by his uncle Abner created political opposition that would require 7 years of civil war to overcome. The gradual shift of support from Ishbosheth to David reflected growing recognition throughout Israel that divine favor determined political success more effectively than military strategies or numerical strength. Abner's defection, following his quarrel with Ishbosheth over concubine rights, brought the northern kingdom's most competent military commander into David's camp. His subsequent assassination by Joab, avenging a brother's death in earlier combat, revealed the blood feuds that complicated political reconciliation. David's response to Abner's murder, public mourning, and explicit condemnation of Joab's action maintained moral high ground while preventing northern leaders from viewing their former general's death as evidence of southern treachery. "Know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel," David proclaimed, honoring his former enemy while distancing himself from those whose violence threatened the fragile progress toward national unity. The assassination of Ishbosheth by his own bodyguards, who brought his severed head to David, expecting rewardal, eliminated the final obstacle to reunification while testing David's commitment to justice over political expedience. His immediate execution of the murderers demonstrated that sacred kingship required moral consistency, regardless of personal advantage. The honor given to Ishbosheth's burial established precedent for treating former opponents with dignity, encouraging future reconciliation rather than perpetuating cycles of vengeance. The unanimous coronation ceremony at Hebron that made David king over all Israel represented far more than political victory. It was divine vindication of choices made decades earlier, when Samuel anointed the overlooked shepherd boy in his father's house. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. This sacred moment marked not merely the beginning of a new administration, but the fulfillment of providence that had been working steadily through persecution, exile, and civil war to establish a dynasty that would transform history. Jerusalem fell to David like a ripe fruit from a tree that had been waiting centuries for the right hand to pluck it. The ancient Jebusite fortress, previously impervious to conquest, surrendered to the tactical brilliance of David's warriors, who discovered and exploited a vulnerability in the city's defenses that had remained hidden for generations. More than mere military triumph, David's choice of Jerusalem as capital was a masterstroke of political unity, situated precisely on the border between Judah and Benjamin. The city belonged to neither tribe, yet could embrace them, both a neutral ground where ancient rivalries could dissolve into national identity. Under David's visionary leadership, Jerusalem metamorphosed from pagan stronghold into the eternal heart of Israel's spiritual and political life. Divine favor manifested through human ingenuity, as construction projects transformed the captured hill into a functioning capital. Palace walls rose against the sky. Administrative buildings created spaces where governance could flourish, and a bustling infrastructure emerged to support the kingdom's growing ambitions. When Tyrian craftsmen arrived, bearing cedar and expertise, their presence signaled more than just commercial exchange. It was international recognition that Israel had finally taken its place among legitimate powers. The Philistines observed David's coronation with growing alarm, recognizing that a unified Israel threatened everything they had worked to build. Their military campaigns in the valley of Rephaim represented a desperate gambit to crush Israel's resurgence before it gained unstoppable momentum. Yet what the Philistines failed to understand was that the same divine hand that had elevated a shepherd to kingship now protected his throne. Despite facing superior Philistine weaponry and battle tactics, David's forces achieved victories that defied conventional military explanations. Supernatural strategies turned the invaders' strengths into weaknesses, effectively eliminating the foreign threat that had originally spurred Israel to demand a king. When David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, he crowned his political achievements with theological significance. The elaborate procession that carried the sacred symbol through Jerusalem's gates was more than pageantry. It was a profound statement that this monarchy would not merely imitate surrounding nations, but would remain anchored in covenant relationship with God. Unlike other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, where religion served the state, David established a capital where state and faith existed in dynamic partnership, each strengthening the other while maintaining distinct identities. The journey of the ark carried its own sobering lesson when Uzzah, reaching out to steady the sacred chest as it wobbled on the cart, fell dead at the touch of his hand. This shocking moment rippled through the procession like lightning, silencing celebration and leaving David himself angry and afraid. The king's initial rage at what seemed divine overreaction gradually softened into reverent understanding that holiness demanded precise protocols regardless of good intentions. 3 months of careful preparation followed before David would attempt the transfer again, this time with Levites carrying the ark with poles as prescribed in ancient law rather than a cart borrowed from Philistine practice. When the ark finally reached its destination in the tent David had prepared, Jerusalem became more than a political capital. It became the spiritual nexus where heaven and earth touched. The king's unrestrained dancing before the ark, whirling with all his might in linen ephod rather than royal robes, demonstrated that true worship transcended dignity and decorum to embrace abandonment to joy. When his wife, Michal, scorned this display as beneath royal dignity, her criticism revealed the gulf between aristocratic formality and authentic devotion, a tension that would resurface throughout Israel's history whenever genuine spiritual expression confronted institutional religion. In the quiet aftermath of the ark's installation, David conceived a plan to build a permanent temple, a house of cedar, to replace the tent of cloth. When the prophet Nathan initially blessed this impulse, it seemed the natural next step in establishing Jerusalem's sacred character. Yet divine revelation intervened, reversing Nathan's approval while simultaneously expanding David's vision beyond anything he could have imagined. The temple would indeed be built, but by David's son rather than David himself. More astonishingly, while David wished to build God a house, God promised instead to build David a house, a dynasty that would transcend generations. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. With these words, what had begun as a simple construction project transformed into covenant promise that would echo through millennia. The assurance that divine love would never be withdrawn from David's line, as it had been from Saul's, planted seeds of messianic expectation that would blossom in unexpected ways, sustaining Jewish hope through exile, occupation, and dispersion. What began as architectural ambition became theological foundation for faith that would outlast temples of stone. David's response to these promises revealed the humility that remained his core strength despite the power he now wielded. Sitting before the Lord in the ark's tent, the king who commanded armies and ruled nations found himself speechless with wonder. Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? In that moment of authentic bewilderment, David acknowledged the mysterious grace that had transformed a youngest son tending sheep into sovereign ruling an empire, recognizing that divine choice rather than personal merit had elevated him to greatness. As David consolidated his kingdom, military campaigns systematically dismantled the regional powers that had previously threatened Israel's existence. One by one, traditional enemies fell: Philistines, Moabites, Arameans, Ammonites, and Edomites' influence stretched from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt. Each victory generated tribute that filled royal coffers, accumulating resources that would later fund Solomon's ambitious building projects. The war with Ammon began with David's gesture of kindness toward King Hanun, following his father's death. But Ammonite suspicion transformed goodwill into conflict. As the siege of Rabbah dragged into months, it created the backdrop for David's darkest moral failure, the Bathsheba affair, that would forever shadow his legacy. From his palace rooftop, David's gaze fell upon Bathsheba bathing, a moment of temptation that exposed how thoroughly power could corrupt even the man after God's own heart, with accountability structures crumbling before royal desire. David's progression from lust to adultery to murder revealed that covenant relationship did not immunize kings against temptation, but rather amplified the consequences of their failures. When Nathan confronted the king with his parable of the rich man who stole a poor man's beloved lamb, the prophet demonstrated courage that transcended self-preservation, daring to speak truth to absolute power when no one else would. "You are the man," thundered across the throne room, stripping away royal pretense and forcing David to confront the magnitude of his crimes. The king's immediate acknowledgement, without excuse or deflection, opened a door for restoration. Even as the judgment followed, "The sword shall never depart from your house." Divine forgiveness would be granted, but temporal consequences would reverberate through generations. The tragic cycles of violence that subsequently consumed David's family: Amnon's rape of his half-sister Tamar, Absalom's murder of Amnon, and ultimately Absalom's rebellion against his father, all flowed from the poisoned spring of David's own moral failure. Yet, in his response to these painful consequences, David revealed the character that ultimately distinguished him from Saul. Where Saul had deflected blame and justified disobedience when confronted with his failures, David accepted responsibility and submitted to discipline. His simple confession, "I have sinned against the Lord," became the foundation for restoration that transformed judgment into mercy without compromising justice. Absalom's rebellion revealed how quickly political achievement could crumble when moral foundations were compromised. The prince's physical beauty, personal charm, and apparent concern for justice resonated with citizens who had grown disillusioned with royal administration. For years of patient preparation allowed Absalom to cultivate support throughout the kingdom before declaring himself king at Hebron, the same city where David's reign had begun. When David fled Jerusalem rather than risk the city's destruction in civil war, he faced the ultimate test of his faith in divine promises. As priests prepared to carry the ark into exile alongside the king, David made the remarkable decision to send it back. "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place." Even in exile, he recognized that covenant relationship transcended political circumstance. As David's entourage climbed the Mount of Olives, fleeing the capital he had established, Shemaiah, relative of Saul's family, emerged on a hillside to curse the fallen king, hurling stones and accusations. Come out, you man of blood, you worthless man." When David's warriors sought permission to silence the abuser with a sword, the king's response revealed spiritual maturity born of suffering. "Let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David.'" This extraordinary humility before enemies demonstrated a soul that had learned to see even opposition as potentially part of divine discipline, an attitude that created space for eventual restoration. The decisive battle in the forest of Ephraim demonstrated that divine favor had not permanently abandoned David despite his failures. Against all military logic, his smaller force of loyal veterans devastated Absalom's numerically superior army, inflicting 20,000 casualties while suffering minimal losses. The forest itself seemed to fight for David, claiming more rebels than the sword. This supernatural intervention proved that covenant loyalty transcended human unfaithfulness, though justice still demanded that consequences play out to their conclusion. When news arrived that Absalom had died caught by his famous hair in an oak tree and executed by Joab, against explicit royal commands, David's reaction transcended political necessity. His anguished cry, "O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you," revealed paternal love that eclipsed considerations of state. This unchecked grief created a crisis that threatened to undermine the very victory that had restored his throne. Joab's brutal confrontation. "You have shamed the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life," forced the king to recognize that personal emotion had to be balanced with public responsibility. The throne demanded that private grief be subordinated to national healing. As David returned to Jerusalem, his treatment of former rebels established precedents for reconciliation that would serve Israel through future conflicts. He pardoned Shimei despite the curses that had been heaped on his head during exile. He restored Mephibosheth despite conflicting reports about his loyalty. He showed consideration to elderly Barzillai, who had supplied the royal forces during their exile. Each act of mercy demonstrated leadership that understood the crucial importance of healing national wounds, rather than punishing defeated opponents. The final years of David's reign witnessed the establishment of sophisticated administrative systems that would enable his son's ambitious projects. Israel's transformation from loose tribal confederation into centralized monarchy accelerated as David organized professional armies with career soldiers loyal to the crown rather than clan. A developing civil service administered royal policies across increasingly diverse territories. Economic structures generated substantial revenue through taxation and tribute from conquered peoples. Together, these institutional developments laid the groundwork for imperial expansion that would reach its zenith under Solomon, enabling the Golden Age that followed. David's controversial census revealed the corrupting nature of power. The shepherd king, who once relied solely on divine provision, now counted soldiers as if military might, not heavenly favor, secured the nation. Joab's reluctance to carry out the command spoke volumes. Some royal edicts violate sacred principles, regardless of political expedience. The resulting plague swept through Israel like wildfire, claiming 70,000 lives and demonstrating that even kings cannot escape divine judgment. Yet, when the destroying angel stood over Jerusalem with sword extended, mercy intervened at David's heartfelt repentance. His anguished cry, "I am the one who has sinned and done evil. But these sheep, what have they done?" exemplified true leadership, shielding followers from consequences of royal folly. At Araunah's threshing floor, where death's shadow halted, the foundation for Israel's spiritual center would rise. When offered the land as a gift, David's response revealed his understanding of authentic worship. "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing." True devotion demands sacrifice. Relationship with the divine cannot be purchased cheaply. As David's life ebbed, succession drama unfolded. While Adonijah prematurely celebrated his coronation at En-Rogel, David's decisive action anointed Solomon at Gihon Spring. This final exercise of royal authority averted civil war, demonstrating that effective leadership sometimes requires bold decisions that transcend protocol when the nation's future hangs in balance. David's deathbed counsel to Solomon blended pragmatic statecraft with spiritual wisdom. Be strong and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways. The dying king recognized that institutional success ultimately depends more on divine blessing than human capability, a lesson Solomon would tragically forget. With David laid to rest, Solomon secured his throne through swift, calculated action. The execution of Joab and Shema threats his father had spared completed justice long deferred. The young king demonstrated that effective governance sometimes requires resolving problems one's predecessor left unaddressed, even when personal relationships complicate political necessities. Solomon's famous judgment between two mothers claiming the same infant revealed divine wisdom flowing through human authority. His shocking proposal to divide the living child with a sword exposed the counterfeit mother while preserving the infant for its true parent. This display of penetrating insight, discerning truth through understanding, authentic love established Solomon's reputation for supernatural discernment. The administrative genius that reorganized Israel into 12 districts, each governed by appointed officials, revolutionized the kingdom's finances by requiring each district to supply the royal court for 1 month annually. Solomon created a revenue stream that funded unprecedented projects while dismantling clan autonomy. This system fueled extravagance on a scale previously unimaginable: 40,000 stalls of horses, elaborate ceremonial processions, and architectural wonders that would astonish the ancient world. Marriage to Pharaoh's daughter signaled Israel's arrival as a geopolitical power. This alliance, unthinkable during the Judges period, now represented a natural partnership between equals with shared interests in regional stability and commercial prosperity. The very nation that had once fled Egyptian bondage now welcomed Pharaoh's daughter as royal consorta, diplomatic triumph that expanded Israel's influence throughout the Mediterranean. The temple that crowned Jerusalem's skyline embodied Solomon's greatest achievement, fulfilling his father's dream with architectural brilliance that would define Jewish worship for centuries. Every detail, from massive foundation stones to delicate golden vessels, reflected holiness, while showcasing royal resources that transformed vision into reality. The partnership with King Hiram of Tyre brought Lebanese cedar and skilled Phoenician craftsmen to Jerusalem, establishing commercial relationships that benefited both kingdoms. Payments in wheat oil and territorial concessions fostered economic cooperation that transcended political boundaries, enabling what neither kingdom could accomplish alone. 7 years of meticulous construction demonstrated royal commitment to excellence that refused shortcuts despite enormous costs. The 183,300 workers mobilized for this sacred project transformed Israel from a pastoral society into an industrial power capable of competing with established empires. When the temple stood complete, a dedication ceremony gathered dignitaries from throughout the known world. Solomon's prayer acknowledged divine transcendence with humbling insight. Heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this temple which I have built. Yet he requested blessing on this house that would focus covenant relationship for generations. The glory cloud that filled the sanctuary, so thick that priests could not stand to minister, confirmed divine approval. Earthly structures could indeed host heavenly presence when built in proper relationship. The royal palace complex, requiring 13 years to complete, rivaled the architectural wonders of Egypt and Mesopotamia. This sprawling compoundie featuring the House of the Forest of Lebanon, the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of Judgment, and the royal residence proclaimed through stone and cedar that Israel had arrived as a regional superpower. What had been a collection of tribal territories 3 generations earlier now stood as an empire whose splendor impressed even ancient kingdoms accustomed to grandeur. The Queen of Sheba's famous visit validated Solomon's international reputation. After testing him with hard questions, this formidable ruler from southern Arabia declared with astonishment, "The half was not told me." Her caravan, laden with gold, spices, and precious stones, established diplomatic connections that would benefit both kingdoms through expanded trade routes, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Solomon's commercial empire generated wealth that transformed Israel from pastoral tribes into an international trading power. Royal administrators maximized every resource: gold flowing from distant lands, silver becoming common as stones in Jerusalem, exotic goods arriving in merchant fleets, all demonstrating blessing operating through enterprise. The annual income of 666 talents of gold exceeded the resources of most entire kingdoms, funding extravagances that dazzled visitors. Shields of beaten gold, an ivory throne overlaid with pure gold, and drinking vessels crafted from precious metals rather than common materials. Yet within this golden age lurked seeds of destruction. The magnificent structures that proclaimed Solomon's glory arose through forced labor that bred resentment among northern clans, who provided workers but received fewer benefits than Judah. The crushing taxation that funded royal luxury imposed burdens reminiscent of the Egyptian oppression their ancestors had escaped. The diplomatic marriages that secured alliances gradually compromised Israel's spiritual distinctiveness as Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines brought their gods into the very heart of the covenant nation. The aging king's spiritual compromise stunned the nation. The man who had built Yahweh's magnificent temple now erected high places for King Ashmolech and other foreign deities whose rituals included child sacrifice and ritual prostitution. This direct violation of the first commandment established precedents for religious syncretism that would haunt subsequent generations. The wisest king had become the greatest fool, abandoning discernment for desire. Divine judgment fell with measured severity. "I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Even in discipline, mercy remained covenant obligations applied to even the most successful rulers. Yet promises to David would not be completely abandoned. Adversaries arose during Solomon's declining years, foreshadowing troubles that would intensify after his death. Hadad returned from Egyptian exile to reclaim Edomite territory. Rezon established Syrian independence, and Jeroboam gained influence among northern clans chafing under royal demands. These political challenges revealed how quickly divine favor could be withdrawn when covenant obligations were abandoned. Spiritual apostasy produced tangible consequences in the political realm. The heavy yoke of Solomon's administration gradually shifted royal priorities from service to self-aggrandizement. The magnificence that impressed foreign visitors oppressed domestic subjects who bore its cost through taxation, conscription, and forced labor, reminiscent of the bondage their ancestors had escaped. The wisdom that had once distinguished Solomon now served only his appetites rather than his people's needs. When Solomon died after 40 years on the throne, he left a kingdom poised on the edge of fragmentation. The realm that had reached unprecedented heights of wealth, power, and international recognition now stood vulnerable. Its foundation eroded by spiritual compromise and popular discontent. David's dynasty faced its greatest test. Could it survive the consequences of Solomonic excess? The ultimate irony was complete. The monarchy, demanded to make Israel like other nations, had succeeded beyond all expectation, producing wealth, power, and prestige that surpassed contemporary empires. Yet, in becoming like other nations, Israel had lost the distinctive relationship with God that had been its true source of strength. The very success that fulfilled popular demands for conventional kingship contained seeds of destruction that would teach future generations the steep price of abandoning divine calling for earthly glory. Solomon's golden age would be followed by centuries of division, decline, and eventual exile, a sobering lesson in the dangers of success divorced from covenant faithfulness. Part 5. A Kingdom Divided. Israel and Judah. Solomon's glittering empire, built over 40 years of unparalleled prosperity, crumbled in a single fateful day at Shechem. In this ancient city, where Joshua had once challenged the tribes to choose their allegiance, Rehoboam now stood at the crossroads of history. Before him lay a momentous choice. Could David's grandson preserve the realm his father had crafted through wisdom and his grandfather had forged through blood? The tribal representatives who gathered carried not just grievances, but the collective weight of generations who had paid for Solomon's splendor with their sweat, their taxes, and their freedom. Into this powder keg stepped Jeroboam, freshly returned from Egyptian exile. His presence electrified the northern tribes with possibilities they had scarcely dared whisper during Solomon's oppressive final years. This administrative genius, whose talents had once caught Solomon's eye before prophetic promises drove him into Pharaoh's protection, now embodied the North's desperate hopes for liberation from Jerusalem's yoke. "Your father made our burden unbearable," Jeroboam announced, voicing the frustrations Solomon's magnificence had trampled underfoot. "Lighten the crushing service your father demanded and the heavy taxes he imposed, and we will serve you loyally." The proposition was reasonable, the tone measured, the request modest. Yet, beneath this diplomatic veneer lay an ultimatum that would test whether the United Kingdom could evolve beyond the autocratic structures that had enabled Solomon's grandeur while suffocating the common people. Rehoboam's request for 3 days' deliberation seemed promising, suggesting thoughtful consideration of competing interests against the backdrop of national unity. Solomon's veteran advisors counseled pragmatic moderation, their words revealing deep understanding of power's true nature. Be a servant to these people today, speak kindly to them, and address their concerns, and they will be your loyal subjects forever. Instead, Rehoboam turned to his childhood companion's palace-bred courtiers, whose worldview had been shaped by witnessing absolute power rather than experiencing its crushing weight. Their advice echoed with the hollow arrogance of privilege that had never faced consequence. "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist," Rehoboam sneered when the assembly reconvened, contempt dripping from every syllable, directed at the very people whose labor had built his luxurious upbringing. "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will use scorpions." The response was swift and devastating. "What portion have we in David? We have no inheritance in Jesse's son. To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, David." This ancient battle cry once used to rally tribal independence against Philistine oppression now shattered the united monarchy that 3 generations of Davidic leadership had painstakingly constructed by choosing intimidation over reconciliation. Rehoboam had transformed political dissatisfaction into full-blown revolution. The stoning of Adoram, Rehoboam's tax collector, punctuated this declaration of independence with shocking violence, revealing how completely royal authority had collapsed beyond Judah's borders. The very official who had symbolized Solomon's oppressive demands became the revolution's first casualty, inaugurating a civil war that would fracture Abraham's descendants for the next 2 centuries. The assembly at Shechem that proclaimed Jeroboam king over the northern tribes represented more than mere rebellion, was constitutional innovation challenging fundamental assumptions about authority across the ancient Near East, while traditional kingdoms claimed legitimacy through divine appointment or hereditary succession. This new northern state derived its authority from popular consent expressed through representative assembly. Yet this revolutionary foundation created immense challenges that would haunt the northern kingdom throughout its turbulent existence. Jeroboam faced the impossible task of establishing institutional legitimacy that could compete with Jerusalem's sacred prestige. David's dynastic claims and Solomon's temple, which remained the spiritual center for all 12 tribes despite political division. The golden calves Jeroboam erected at Dan and Bethel represented desperate attempts to create alternatives that could rival the temple's spiritual gravity while maintaining theological orthodoxy. "It is too burdensome for you to journey to Jerusalem," he declared, offering practical alternatives to religious obligations that Southern control had made politically dangerous. "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from Egypt." The irony was bitter, the precedent ominous. The words once used to describe Aaron's golden calf during the Sinai rebellion now echoed across the divided kingdom as justification for a new tradition. Jeroboam cleverly positioned his golden calves not as gods themselves, but as pedestals for the invisible presence of Yahweh, following ancient Near Eastern traditions, where animal imagery served as divine thrones rather than objects of worship. But the line between sacred symbol and forbidden idol blurred with alarming speed. Jeroboam's creation of a parallel priesthood drove the final wedge between the kingdoms. Rejecting the Levitical priests whose allegiances remained with Jerusalem's temple, he appointed common men who would prioritize royal policy over covenant tradition. His calendar, innovations mirroring Southern festivals but shifted by 1 month, created a competing religious system that made reconciliation increasingly unthinkable. Then came Pharaoh Shishak's devastating invasion in Rehoboam's 5th year, a brutal reminder of how division had transformed Solomon's mighty empire into vulnerable prey. His armies swept through both kingdoms like wildfire, seizing fortified cities and plundering generations of accumulated wealth. In Jerusalem, Solomon's magnificent golden shield symbols of unmatched prosperity were replaced with humble bronze replicas, a tangible reminder of diminished glory. The borderlands between the kingdoms transformed from administrative boundaries into militarized zones scarred by constant warfare. Brother literally fought against brother as fortified cities rose along the frontier, each side battling for control of strategic heights and vital trade routes. The map, once unified under David's banner, became a patchwork of contested territories and shifting allegiances. Jeroboam's 22-year reign established northern identity while exposing fatal weaknesses. though he successfully maintained independence against southern pressure. His religious innovations planted seeds of theological corruption that would haunt every subsequent generation. The sin of Jeroboam, worship at unauthorized sanctuaries served by illegitimate priests, became the measuring rod by which prophets would condemn all future kings. When Jeroboam died, the constitutional fragility of his realm became immediately apparent. His son, Nadab's assassination after barely 2 years began a bloody pattern that would define northern politics. Baasha, the usurper, systematically exterminated Jeroboam's entire family, fulfilling prophetic warnings while establishing the brutal precedent of dynastic elimination that would make stable governance virtually impossible. From this chaos emerged Omri, victor in a 4-year succession struggle, who would transform the breakaway territory into a regional power. His visionary purchase of Samaria's hill and construction of an imposing new capital revealed remarkable strategic foresight. Perched on defensible heights overlooking major trade routes, the new city announced to the world the North's determination to control its economic destiny rather than surrender to southern dominance. International legitimacy came through Omri's shrewd alliance with Phoenician Tyre, sealed by his son Ahab's marriage to Princess Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbal of Sidon. This diplomatic masterstroke connected the northern kingdom to Mediterranean commercial networks and granted access to Phoenician maritime technology, craftsmanship, and sophisticated cultural influences. Ahab's succession marked the beginning of the most dramatic chapter in northern history, confrontation between prophetic authority and royal policy. Jezebel's zealous promotion of Baal worship transcended Jeroboam's pragmatic compromises, threatening to completely replace covenant relationship with Canaanite fertility rites. The royal court now hosted 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, systematic attempt to supplant traditional spiritual leadership with foreign-trained religious authorities. His thunderous declaration that rain would fall only at his command directly challenged Baal's supposed mastery over storms and the crown's claim to absolute authority. The devastating 3-and-a-half-year drought that followed vindicated his prophetic authority, while creating economic devastation that touched every household from palatial estates to humble villages. Elijah's meticulous preparation, rebuilding the altar with 12 stones symbolizing tribal unity, drenching the sacrifice repeatedly to eliminate any possibility of deception. His prayer acknowledging divine sovereignty created circumstances where supernatural intervention would be unmistakable. When fire from heaven consumed not just the sacrifice, but the stones, wood, and water, it ignited a momentary national revival that proved Yahweh remained Israel's true God despite royal apostasy. Elijah's life forced the victorious prophet into wilderness exile, a sobering demonstration that even the most dramatic spiritual triumph required sustained institutional support that prophetic authority alone could not provide. Ahab's fatal wound at Ramoth-Gilead extinguished the northern kingdom's most formidable ruler, leaving the throne in perilous uncertainty as Syrian forces gathered at the borders. The brief reign of his son Ahaziah revealed the spiritual degradation that had consumed the royal house when gravely injured in a fall. He bypassed Israel's God entirely, instead sending messengers to consult Baalzebub of Ekron, a foreign deity whose name mockingly translates to Lord of the Flies. The prophetic anointing of Jehu marked a divine intervention in history that would violently uproot Omri's dynasty. In a dramatic, secret ceremony within the military camp at Ramoth Gilead, Elisha's disciple poured sacred oil over the commander's head, simultaneously conferring both divine legitimacy and a sacred mandate to purge Baal worship from the land. This clandestine ritual effectively created a parallel authority structure, sanctioning revolution with heaven's approval. Jehu's infamous chariot ride to Jezreel unfolded like a gathering storm, his reputation as Israel's most reckless charioteer driving him toward destiny at breakneck speed. When King Joram rode out to meet him, the arrow that pierced his heart carried both Jehu's ambition and divine judgment. The king's body tumbled onto the very soil of Naboth's vineyard, the same ground where his father had orchestrated an innocent man's judicial murder decades earlier, fulfilling the prophet's word with chilling precision. Queen Jezebel's final moments captured her indomitable spirit. Rather than flee or hide, she applied her royal cosmetics and arranged her hair in elaborate court style before appearing at her window. This defiant final performance, maintaining regal dignity even as revolution consumed her world, spoke to a courage that transcended the moral divide. Her death hurled from the palace window and trampled by horses before being consumed by street dogs, until only fragments remained fulfilled, Elijah's prophecy to the letter, while removing the architectural mind behind Baal's rise to prominence. The methodical elimination of Ahab's bloodline unfolded with merciless efficiency. 70 royal sons were beheaded in a single night, their severed heads delivered to Jezreel in wicker baskets, stacked in 2 gruesome pyramids at the city gate. A public declaration that Omri's line had ended. Jehu's purge expanded outward like concentric circles, engulfing royal cousins, allies, officials, and priests who had supported the previous regime. When Baal worshippers gathered at their temple, lured by Jehu's false promise of an elaborate sacrifice to their god, they found themselves trapped in a sacred slaughterhouse as his soldiers systematically eliminated every adherent of the foreign faith. The symbolic desecration of Baal's temple transformed into a public latrine where citizens would relieve themselves amid the rubble of toppled idols, represented both practical policy and theological statement. No future ruler could easily resurrect this forbidden worship when its sacred space had been so thoroughly profaned. Yet amid this religious purification, Jehu's pragmatic decision to preserve Jeroboam's golden calves at Dan and Bethel revealed the political calculations underlying his reforms. He eliminated foreign elements while carefully maintaining northern religious independence from Jerusalem's pull. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, discovered in the ruins of ancient Nimrod, provides striking physical evidence of Jehu's diminished international position. The relief carving shows the Israelite king or his representative prostrated before the Assyrian emperor, forehead pressed to the ground in abject submission while offering tribute. This humiliating diplomatic ceremony marked Israel's formal entry into the imperial system that would eventually consume its independence entirely. Jehu's 28-year reign established a veneer of orthodox worship while revealing the devastating costs his revolution extracted from society. The stability he achieved came at the price of isolation on the international stage. With Jezebel's death, the carefully cultivated Phoenician alliance that had fueled economic prosperity under Omri and Ahab disintegrated. The sophisticated trade networks, artistic exchanges, and commercial opportunities that had connected Israel to Mediterranean markets withered, draining royal coffers and reducing urban prosperity. Relations with Judah, collapsed into open hostility following Amaziah's assassination, eliminating the cooperative defense that had previously enabled both kingdoms to resist Syrian expansion. In Jehu's later years, the Syrian king Hazael systematically dismembered Israel's eastern territories, demonstrating how diplomatic isolation had weakened its strategic position. The loss of Gilead and other Transjordanian regions eliminated crucial agricultural resources and displaced populations who might have defended the frontier, creating a refugee crisis that strained the remaining territories. The dizzying succession of kings that followed Jehu's dynasty exposed the constitutional weakness that prosperity had temporarily masked. Zechariah managed just 6 months on the throne before being publicly assassinated. His usurper, Shallum, barely lasted a month before forces from Tirzah terminated his brief reign. These bloody transitions unfolded against a backdrop of mounting foreign pressure, with neighboring powers circling like predators around a wounded animal. Menammeh's decade-long rule brought temporary stability through calculated brutality. His infamous sacking of Tipsah, where he reportedly ripped open pregnant women, established a reputation for cruelty that discouraged internal opposition. Yet survival required accepting Assyrian domination, reducing Israel to a vassal state with only the trappings of independence. The 1,000 talents of silver he paid to Tiglath-Pileser required unprecedented taxation. 50 shekels extracted from each wealthy landowner, creating internal resentment while barely satisfying imperial appetites. The impossible dilemma faced by each successive ruler became clear: maintain foreign approval through tribute and compliance, or preserve domestic support by resisting imperial demands. Pekah's desperate alliance with Damascus against Assyrian expansion represented a final bid for true independence through regional coalition. The gamble failed spectacularly. Tiglath-Pileser's punitive campaign sliced away entire regions: Galilee, Gilead, and the coastal plains, transforming them into direct Assyrian provinces administered by imperial governors. The deportation of their populations and importation of foreign settlers began the demographic engineering that would eventually erase Israelite identity. The kingdom shrank to a fraction of its former territory, losing the fertile agricultural lands and trade routes that had sustained its economy. Hoshei's installation as an Assyrian puppet following Pekah's assassination barely disguised the reality that independence had effectively ended. His realm was a shadow kingdom permitted to exist only through imperial sufferance. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, the dream of freedom persisted. When Assyrian tribute demands became unbearable, Hoshei secretly reached out to Egypt, grasping at the slender reed of foreign alliance that had betrayed so many of his predecessors. The final siege of Samaria became a testament to northern determination, if not wisdom. For 3 grueling years, from 725 to 722 BCE, the city's massive walls and resolute defenders held out against the world's most sophisticated military machine. Assyrian engineers constructed ramps and siege towers, while sappers undermined foundations. Inside, food dwindled and water became precious, as the population endured conditions deteriorating from hardship to horror. When the city finally fell, Assyrian records boast of deporting 27,290 people, not random captives, but specifically the educated elites, skilled artisans, military leaders, and administrative personnel who might have preserved cultural identity in exile. Their calculated dispersal throughout the empire's eastern provinces ensured they would be absorbed into local populations within generations. The colonization program that followed represents one of history's first documented instances of deliberate demographic engineering. Foreign settlers from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim were transplanted into the depopulated territories, bringing their gods and customs to Israelite soil. These displaced peoples, combined with the remnants of the native population who had escaped deportation, would eventually form the mixed community, later known as Samaritans, the lost tribes of Israel that would capture imagination in later centuries. Weren't simply scattered, they were systematically erased through imperial policy designed to prevent exactly the kind of national resurrection that might threaten Assyrian rule. Like a flame snuffed out by winter winds, the northern kingdom, which had maintained its independence for over 2 centuries, vanished into the mists of time. Where vibrant cities once bustled with commerce and royal courts echoed with diplomatic intrigue, only scattered ruins remained. Archaeological fragments and sacred scrolls became the sole witnesses to its triumphs and tragedies. Meanwhile, the southern realm of Judah, watching from beyond the horizon as their kinsmen disappeared into exile, inherited a dual legacy: the sacred responsibility of preserving the covenant relationship and the haunting warning of what befell those who exchanged divine calling for fleeting worldly advantage. The lesson etched itself into collective memory with unmistakable clarity. The precedent stood ominous as a storm cloud on the horizon. The choice facing each generation remained unavoidable as death itself. True independence demanded both spiritual fidelity and material stewardship. Mere prosperity without moral foundation inevitably crumbled into national ruin. The North's catastrophic fate would echo through centuries as a prophetic warning to all who face the eternal choice between covenant loyalty and cultural compromise. As these truths crystallized in Judah's consciousness, the smoke from Samaria's smoldering ruins still darkened the northern sky. Part 6, the final chapter, Judah's last stand. When a delegation arrived at Hezekiah's court bearing grim tidings, the unthinkable had become reality. The northern realm that had stubbornly defied Assyrian might for 3 grueling years had vanished from the map. Some 27,000 of their kinsmen now trudged along distant roads in chains, scattered like seeds across the vast Assyrian empire, stretching from the misty shores of the Caspian Sea to the sun-baked lands along the Persian Gulf. The lost tribes would never again set foot on their ancestral soil. Now Judah stood alone against the gathering storm, the last flickering flame of David's storied dynasty, the final guardian of Solomon's magnificent sanctuary, the sole remnant of the people who had once marched triumphantly across Canaan under Joshua's banner. King Hezekiah received this devastating news while standing in the shadow of the very temple his ancestor had built. Its golden vessels still caught the morning light. Its white-robed priests still performed the daily sacrifices that had continued unbroken for 2 centuries. But everyone within Jerusalem's ancient walls understood the unspoken question that hung heavy in the incense-laden air like an invisible shroud. How long before Assyrian war machines surrounded these hallowed walls? How long before the sacred treasures were loaded onto creaking carts bound for distant Nineveh? The answer arrived with terrifying swiftness. Sennacherib's formidable forces swept through the Judean countryside like a devouring plague, systematically capturing 46 fortified cities and dragging away 200,150 people, according to the Assyrian king's own boastful inscriptions. One by one, cities opened their gates in desperate surrender. Fortress after fortress crumbled before sophisticated siege engines that had perfected their deadly craft across a dozen brutal campaigns. Yet, in this darkest hour, Hezekiah made a choice that would echo through the ages. Faith over fear, sacred loyalty over political calculation. When Assyrian negotiators stood beneath Jerusalem's imposing walls and shouted their ultimatum in fluent Hebrew, ensuring every defender could understand their chilling message, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he cannot possibly deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in your God." The king's response came not through diplomatic channels, but through desperate, fervent prayer in Solomon's sanctuary. Isaiah's prophetic answer arrived like thunder breaking through the darkness. "Therefore, thus says the Lord, concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not enter this city, nor shoot a single arrow there. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake." That night, death itself walked silently through the Assyrian encampment. When dawn's first light crept over Jerusalem's walls, 185,000 of the empire's finest warriors lay mysteriously dead in their tents. Sennacherib, who had arrogantly boasted he would render Judah's God as powerless as the forgotten deities of Damascus and Samaria, fled back to Nineveh in terror, where his own sons would eventually murder him in his sanctuary, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy with chilling precision. The lesson stood unmistakable, etched in history. The precedent shone with hope. The covenant relationship vindicated when kings trusted in divine promises rather than chariots and political alliances. Even the mightiest empire on earth shattered against the rock of divine protection. Hezekiah's miraculous deliverance became the defining moment, proving God's promise to David remained unbroken. Yet, ironically, this very triumph planted seeds of spiritual complacency that would poison future generations. Hezekiah's son Manasseh inherited a throne secured by divine intervention, a capital enriched by Assyria's humiliating withdrawal, a kingdom convinced of its own invincibility. For 55 long years, the longest reign of any Judean monarch, he systematically transformed Jerusalem into a cesspool of every abomination the law had explicitly forbidden. Pagan altars to foreign gods sprouted like poisonous weeds in the sacred courts where Solomon had once offered pure sacrifices. Child sacrifice, the most abhorrent practice imaginable, resumed in the valley of Hinnom, where innocent cries rose with the smoke of burning flesh. Witchcraft and divination replaced prophetic counsel as royal policy fell under the influence of mediums rather than divine guidance. The courageous prophetic voices that dared protest this wholesale apostasy were silenced through persecution so brutal and systematic that ancient tradition records Isaiah himself being sawn in two. During Manasseh's dark reign, the people, miraculously delivered from Assyrian destruction, now faced divine judgment far more terrible than any earthly empire could inflict. "I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab," came the devastating verdict through prophets whose names history has forgotten. "I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down." Josiah's unexpected accession at the tender age of 8 offered one final golden opportunity for national repentance and restoration. This remarkable young king launched the most comprehensive religious reform movement in the nation's tumultuous history. The high places that had corrupted worship for centuries were demolished stone by stone. The foreign altars that had polluted the sanctuary were smashed to dust. The mediums and spiritists who had replaced prophetic guidance were expelled from the land. The dramatic discovery of the Book of the Law during temple renovation provided electrifying confirmation that reform was both necessary and desperately urgent. When the ancient scroll was read aloud before King Josiah, he tore his royal robes in anguish, suddenly recognizing how catastrophically far the nation had strayed from divine requirements. The Passover celebration that followed became the greatest since Samuel's distant era, drawing pilgrims from throughout the fractured kingdom to observe the sacred feast commemorating their ancestors' deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Yet even Josiah's exemplary faithfulness could not erase the accumulated guilt of generations, who had trampled every covenant obligation while presuming upon divine mercy. His tragic death at Megiddo, cut down in his prime while attempting to intercept Pharaoh Necho's northward march, marked the bitter end of hope for peaceful reform. The 4 kings who followed would preside over the final, irreversible collapse of everything their ancestors had built and cherished. Jehoiachin's reckless rebellion against Babylonian authority transformed the kingdom from Assyrian vassal to Babylon's prime target, while demonstrating the political blindness that divine judgment inevitably produces. His fateful decision to align with Egypt reflected precisely the same fatal calculation that had destroyed the northern kingdom, trusting in human alliances rather than divine protection. The first devastating siege of Jerusalem in 597 BCE ended in humiliating surrender that stripped the sanctuary of its treasures, while carrying away 10,000 of the nation's most vital citizens, skilled craftsmen, administrators, and potential leaders. Young Ezekiel was among these first exiles, who began their long captivity beside Babylon's alien rivers. The golden vessels that Solomon had lovingly crafted for divine worship now gleamed in Nebuchadnezzar's opulent palace halls. Zedekiah's appointment as vassal king provided one last, fleeting opportunity for wisdom to prevail over pride. The weeping prophet Jeremiah's constant warnings, "Serve the king of Babylon and live," offered a practical path that could have preserved the city, the sanctuary, and the people. Yet, false prophets who promised swift liberation proved more persuasive than the solitary voice whose tears mirrored divine sorrow over Jerusalem's approaching doom. The final, fatal rebellion began with clandestine negotiations between Zedekiah and Egypt, the very nation that had enslaved Abraham's descendants a millennium earlier. The irony cut deeper than any Babylonian sword. In desperately seeking freedom from foreign occupation, the people were turning for help to the very power from which the Lord had dramatically delivered them through Moses. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and merciless. The siege that began in 588 BCE stretched across 18 hellish months, reducing Jerusalem's population to walking skeletons, while methodically eliminating every aspect of normal life. The biblical account records that mothers, driven mad by starvation, cooked and ate their own children as famine reached depths that Deuteronomy had explicitly warned would accompany covenant abandonment. The city once celebrated as beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth, became a charnel house where death stalked every street. Jerusalem's ancient walls' stalwart guardians, since David's triumphant conquest, finally surrendered on the 9th day of the 4th month. 586 BCE, Babylonian soldiers surged through the breaches like a relentless tide, their torches transforming centuries of royal legacy into crackling infernos. The magnificent palace that had sheltered David's lineage became a blazing pyre against the night sky. Yet this devastation merely foreshadowed the impending catastrophe. When Nebuzaradan arrived on the 7th day of the 5th month, he carried orders that would sever the sacred connection between heaven and earth, established during Solomon's reign. The temple's remaining treasures, magnificent bronze pillars, the vast molten sea, delicately crafted golden lampstands, and the aromatic altar of incenseware systematically plundered. Every consecrated artifact was callously dismantled and carted away to foreign lands before the ultimate desecration commenced. Solomon's majestic temple, where the Ark of the Covenant had dwelled, where divine presence had moved among mortals, where countless prayers had ascended like sweet incense for generations surrupted in flames. The conflagration reached skyward as if offering one final, terrible sacrifice. The spiritual heart of the nation crumbled into smoldering ruins of charred stone and bitter ash, its glory extinguished. Zedekiah's desperate flight toward Jericho ended in a tragedy befitting the dynasty's ignoble conclusion. The Babylonians executed his sons before his horrified gaze, extinguishing David's royal line in a single brutal moment. Then, with calculated cruelty, they gouged out Zedekiah's eyes, ensuring this unspeakable slaughter would haunt his eternal darkness. The king, who had betrayed both divine covenant and human allegiance, was led away in heavy bronze chains, destined to perish blind and broken in a foreign prison. The systematic deportation that followed uprooted Judah's remaining leadership and scattered the people among distant nations, precisely as Moses had forewarned would be the consequence of covenant betrayal. The meticulously recorded 4,600 exiles represented the nation's intellectual and spiritual backbone. Artisans, scholars, priests, and prophets who had preserved Israel's distinctive identity. Those left behind in the ravaged landscape were predominantly the impoverished and unskilled, incapable of maintaining the sacred traditions that had defined their ancestors. Godaliah's brief governorship and subsequent assassination completed the political disintegration that began with conquest. The remnant who fled to Egypt, ignoring Jeremiah's impassioned warnings, dragged the weeping prophet with them into yet another exile. His final prophecies fell on deaf ears. His tears flowed without effect. The promised land that once overflowed with abundance now lay desolate, cities reduced to rubble, its sanctuary razed, its people dispersed like chaff before the wind. The narrative that commenced with Abraham's faithful journey from Ur to Canaan had come full circle in bitter irony. The descendants called out from pagan nations to become a holy people were now scattered back among those same nations as punishment for their unfaithfulness. The land promised as eternal inheritance lay barren under foreign dominion. The covenant relationship that had been their strength lay shattered by the very people it was meant to exalt. Yet, amidst exile's darkness, within the holy city's ashes, in the silence where temple songs once echoed, the story wasn't ending but transforming. Ezekiel's powerful visions beside the river Chebar revealed dry bones miraculously reviving. Prophetic letters assured the exiles that 70 years would bring restoration. Daniel's fervent prayers within Babylon's imperial halls proved that divine presence transcended Solomon's temple, manifesting wherever faithful hearts earnestly sought the Lord. The physical kingdom lay in ruins. Political sovereignty vanished. The sacred temple burned. The promised land stood empty, yet the divine promises endured unbroken. Prophetic words retained their power. Hope flickered like an inextinguishable flame that no darkness could smother. The people who began as wandering Arameans would learn to preserve their identity in foreign lands while holding fast to memories of the city where God had placed his name. From Jerusalem's smoldering ruins to Babylon's flowing rivers, from temple ashes to foreign royal courts, their story would continue not as a chronicle of political achievement or territorial conquest, but as an epic saga of a people chosen for divine purposes, transcending earthly powers, sustained by promises outlasting temporal disappointments, destined for a restoration that would vindicate every hope their ancestors had cherished in faith. The exile was not the end, it was the dawning of something new. And so our journey through the ancient Hebrew story comes to a close. From nomadic beginnings to empire, from triumph to exile, we've walked alongside a people whose extraordinary legacy continues to shape our world today. I hope these stories have brought you peaceful rest and perhaps a deeper appreciation for how a small nation's spiritual journey changed human history forever. Thank you for joining me on this epic adventure through time. Sleep well, and may you carry these timeless lessons into your dreams.